The significance of Vatican Hill as a cornerstone of religious and geopolitical power is rooted not only in its current symbolism but in the deep temporal layers that precede Christian history. This territory, situated on the west bank of the Tiber River in Rome, was originally regarded as a marginal and even profane area by ancient Romans, contrary to later narratives that would frame it as predestined for holy elevation. The hill was historically a place of gardens, tombs, and foreign cults. The term Vaticanus itself was once associated with oracles and prophetic utterance, implying a mystical but not inherently Christian heritage. The transition of this land from peripheral to central, both geographically and ideologically, demands scrutiny, particularly because that transition rests at the base of Vatican City's justification for exclusivity, sanctity, and secrecy. By the time Christianity gained imperial favor under Constantine, Vatican Hill had already undergone significant transformation. The emperor's decision to construct the original St. Peter's Basilica on this site was not just an act of piety but one of calculated political theater. In choosing this location, Constantine anchored the emerging Christian state religion not in the traditional center of Roman power, the Palatine Hill or Capitoline Hill, but in a newly sanctified space that had to be retroactively infused with apostolic significance. The legend of St. Peter's martyrdom and burial on this site served to imbue the hill with theological gravity, but no definitive archaeological evidence exists to confirm this assertion, beyond conjectural alignment with canonical tradition. The site was chosen, constructed upon, and narrativized into centrality. That process reflects a broader pattern, religious history being not merely recorded, but architected. As centuries passed, the accumulation of physical structures over this landscape mirrored the layering of doctrines, decrees, and myths. The basilicas, chapels, necropolises, and papal tombs that occupy Vatican Hill form more than just a religious complex. They constitute a monument to the continuous assertion of authority. Each layer of stone encases not only remains and relics, but layers of ideological sediment. The deeper one goes beneath the surface. Both literally and historically, the more fragmented and ambiguous the narrative becomes. It is precisely within these obscured and heavily controlled strata that critical questions emerge. What lies beneath the hill's successive reconstructions? What stories were sealed as new ones were elevated? The centralization of Catholic power at this site also provided a strategic advantage in consolidating ecclesiastical legitimacy. By rooting itself in a geography allegedly linked to the first pope, the Church positioned its physical presence as a guarantor of theological continuity. Yet that continuity rests on premises that are unverifiable outside of ecclesiastical documentation. The existence of St. Peter's tomb, the nature of early Christian worship on the site, and the identification of ancient vaults as apostolic in character are all asserted with confidence, but substantiated with selective evidence. The absence of broader archaeological verification or public transparency around these claims forces a reliance on institutional narrative, an epistemological condition that privileges belief over inquiry. This monopolization of physical and symbolic territory also enabled the Vatican to insulate itself from competing religious traditions and historical reinterpretations. Control of the hill meant control of the story. Competing theological movements, such as Arianism or Gnostic sects, lacked territorial centrality, making their extinction easier to facilitate, both through physical suppression and doctrinal condemnation. In this context, Vatican Hill becomes not merely a site of elevation, but of erasure, a landscape where alternative paths were overwritten and physically buried. The role of geography in shaping epistemology is often underestimated. Vatican Hill is not just a place, it is a structure of belief, a spatial argument for legitimacy, a sedimented assertion of orthodoxy. Its inaccessibility to lay investigation and its transformation into a sovereign, Enclave in 1929 further shielded it from external examination. What once was part of the city of Rome is now an autonomous polity with its own laws, guards, and archives. The transformation from marginal necropolis to sovereign religious capital was not incidental. It was the culmination of strategic consecration and narrative engineering. That strategic sanctification is observable in how the Vatican frames its historical presence. It positions itself as the steward of ancient truth, the preserver of divine lineage, and the guardian of apostolic purity. Yet the very tools that enable this stewardship, exclusive access to vaults, control of archives, and authority over excavation, are the same tools that make independent verification impossible. If knowledge is curated behind sealed doors, then its legitimacy rests not on evidence but on institutional fiat. This raises the question, can a claim to historical truth remain valid when the evidentiary base is inaccessible? The convergence of myth, monument, and mandate on Vatican Hill creates a unique kind of epistemological stronghold. Here, belief is reinforced by architecture, and architecture is justified by belief. Each supports the other in a closed circuit that resists external interrogation. It is within this circuit that the issue of the sealed vaults arises, not merely as a curiosity, but as a critical fault line in the study of religious history. These vaults, unknown in full inventory and unexplored by independent scholars, represent not just physical spaces but zones of epistemic exclusion. The opacity surrounding Vatican Hill's subterranean layers is not an anomaly, it is systemic. It reflects a broader orientation toward containment, of knowledge, of bodies, of pasts that do not conform. What lies beneath the hill is not just a collection of bones and artifacts, but potentially entire narratives withheld from historical discourse. The seal is not just on the door, it is on memory itself. The importance of Vatican Hill in the historical record of religion lies not only in what it reveals, but in what it conceals. It is both source and sinca point of origin for theological authority and a final resting place for inconvenient truths. Any investigation into the evidentiary black holes in religious history must begin with the geography that made concealment sacred and questioning profane. Vatican Hill is that geography. The vaults beneath it may contain the answers, but only if the questions are allowed to reach them. Beneath the surface of Vatican Hill lies an elaborate and layered substructure that defies casual exploration. While the visible grandeur of St. Peter's Basilica commands public awe, it is the buried architecture beneath it, the Vatican necropolis, the papal grottos, and the sealed subterranean vaults that invites analytical concern. These spaces are not simply burial chambers or devotional sites. They are engineered environments of control, designed to limit access, obscure visibility, and channel historical interpretation through tightly managed gates. The spatial logic of these subterranean layers offers insight into how architecture itself functions as a mechanism of secrecy and epistemic limitation. The Vatican necropolis, rediscovered in the mid-20th century during renovations ordered by Pope Pius XII, was quickly cloaked in both intrigue and restriction. Officially termed scavi, the site was excavated under papal direction with minimal external oversight. What began as an effort to locate the tomb of St. Peter eventually expanded into the uncovering of a large pagan and early Christian burial complex dating from the 1st to 4th centuries CE. Although fragments of this excavation have been published, much of the site remains inaccessible to the general public and to independent researchers. Access is controlled by the Officio Scavi, which grants limited, guided tours under heavily regulated conditions. No open scholarly work is permitted, and documentation of the vault's full contents remains under institutional lock. This raises fundamental questions about the purpose of restriction. If the necropolis merely affirms canonical history, why not open it broadly for scrutiny? Why is entry permitted only through curated pathways? The argument that preservation necessitates limited access is undermined by the Vatican's own selective excavation practices. Digging in specific areas, ignoring others, and halting exploration at critical junctures suggest a strategy not of preservation but of narrative containment. Areas that might contradict the official placement of St. Peter's tomb or offer alternative interpretations of early Christian rituals are systematically marginalized in official reports. The architectural division between what is shown and what is sealed becomes a filter for historical legitimacy. Further beneath the necropolis lie vaults that have neither been catalogued publicly nor investigated by independent archaeologists. These structures are sealed not only physically but epistemologically. Descriptions of their contents are speculative, often relying on secondary Vatican claims or conjectural hearsay from limited witnesses. What is known is that certain areas beneath the Basilica are entirely off-limits, even to most clerics, let alone scholars. The justification for such restrictions is often framed in terms of sanctity, risk of damage, or national sovereignty. But the underlying effect is to construct an impenetrable zone where historical verification is rendered impossible. Architecture here functions as more than shelter. It becomes a vector of silence. Passageways narrow, lighting disappears, and structural obstacles increase as one descends. The deeper the layer, the more tightly it is controlled. The theological rationale is that these are sacred zones, too holy for profane investigation. But the practical result is that they operate as sealed systems, where entry is not determined by academic merit or investigative protocol, but by ecclesiastical discretion. This transforms a potentially historical site into a fortress of curated memory. Within such a design, the past becomes a function of access rather than evidence. The vaults beneath Vatican Hill are not isolated in their function. They exist within a global matrix of religious sites where restricted access protects not just artifacts but ideologies. Yet Vatican Hill's vaults are unique in their scale and their centrality to the religious-political complex of Catholicism. Unlike minor shrines or rural monasteries, this site is the seat of a sovereign state whose institutional interest in controlling the historical record is deeply embedded in its theological claims. The very legitimacy of the Vatican rests on an unbroken narrative that ties physical location to apostolic succession. Any breach in the architectural veil threatens not just archaeological understanding but doctrinal integrity. The vaults also likely serve as archives for materials too controversial to release. It is plausible that ancient manuscripts, uncanonized, gospels, or relics linked to alternative Christian traditions are housed in these spaces. Their existence would offer counter-narratives that destabilize orthodox timelines. It is notable that unlike other global religious archives, the Vatican rarely announces new discoveries from its vaults. There are no regular reports, no peer-reviewed excavations, no transparency protocols. This silence is itself a statement, one that implies not ignorance but intentional exclusion. The legal status of the vaults adds a further layer of opacity. As part of a sovereign territory, they are not subject to Italian law, European heritage conventions, or international archaeological oversight. They exist in a juridical void where Vatican regulations alone apply. This allows for the retention, concealment, or destruction of materials without external consequence. Legal sovereignty enables historical sovereignty, and the vaults operate as protected anomaly zones where history can be redefined or redacted without scrutiny. The architectural design of the subterranean levels reinforces this condition. Sealed entrances, undocumented corridors, and reinforced barriers serve not just structural functions, but psychological ones. They invoke reverence through denial, shaping perception by controlling access. To descend into these layers is to confront a spatial theology, one that replaces inquiry with submission. The architecture itself becomes part of the catechism, a doctrine rendered in stone, mortar, and absence. This is not a recent development. Historical records suggest that selective sealing of vaults occurred as early as the Renaissance, coinciding with periods of intense theological consolidation and doctrinal enforcement. Popes have historically used subterranean structures not only for interment, but for isolation. Inquisition-era documents hint at the use of vaults for imprisoning heterodox clerics and concealing suspect relics. Whether these structures continue to serve such purposes remains unknown, but the historical precedent aligns with current restrictions. The refusal to allow broad independent excavation or academic documentation transforms the vaults into active participants in historical suppression. They are not neutral spaces waiting to be studied. They are agents of concealment, integrated into the Vatican's larger apparatus of knowledge control. By denying access, the institution controls not just what is known, but what can be asked. Inquiry itself is reshaped, limited, and redirected through pre-authorized narratives. If the Vatican necropolis and sealed vaults represent a buried archive, they are not an archive of the past but of potentiality. What might be found there, the texts, bodies, inscriptions, or relics, remain speculative precisely because investigation is obstructed. The architecture of these spaces, both in physical form and in institutional control, is a manifestation of deliberate unknowability. They do not merely hold secrets. They are designed to remain secret. Any critical investigation into the evidentiary voids in religious history must contend with this architecture of concealment. It is not enough to consider what is visible. One must analyze the spatial logic of what is hidden, sealed, and justified through sanctity. The vaults beneath Vatican Hill, in their inaccessibility, are not just repositories of history, they are monuments to its erasure. The Vatican system of information management operates within a legal and theological structure that has been refined over centuries to prevent unauthorized access to critical materials. This gatekeeping framework is not informal or accidental. It is embedded in canon law, reinforced by ecclesiastical bureaucracy, and protected by international sovereignty. It governs not only who may enter the vaults or archives beneath Vatican Hill, but also who may know that such spaces and documents exist. At the intersection of law, theology, and institutional power lies a model of historical control that is unique in both its scale and durability. Canon law, the internal legal system of the Roman Catholic Church, provides the foundational basis for regulating access to religious knowledge and physical archives. Unlike civil law systems, which are subject to external review and accountability, canon law functions autonomously within the Vatican's jurisdiction. This autonomy enables it to define what constitutes heresy, what must be preserved in secrecy, and what permissions are necessary to examine specific historical materials. Codified in documents such as the Codex Iuris Canonici, canon law grants ecclesiastical authorities, specifically the Holy See, the ultimate discretion over matters of knowledge access. Requests for entry into archives, necropolises, or vaults are filtered through multi-layered bureaucratic protocols that prioritize theological alignment over scholarly merit. This control apparatus is upheld by the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, the Apostolic Penitentiary, and other powerful bodies within the Roman Curia. These institutions are not merely administrative offices. They are ideological enforcers tasked with preserving orthodoxy. They assess the risk associated with releasing certain documents or granting access to specific locations, based not on academic value, but on doctrinal implications. A scholar seeking insight into early Christian burial practices or apocryphal texts may be denied access if their research is perceived to undermine foundational church narratives. The criteria for rejection are opaque, and the appeal process is functionally non-existent. Within this system, secrecy becomes not an exception, but the norm. The legal mechanisms of gatekeeping are further supported by oaths of silence imposed on clergy. archivists and scholars who are granted conditional access, individuals permitted to view sensitive materials, whether in the Vatican Apostolic Archive or in sealed vaults beneath Vatican Hill, are often required to sign agreements forbidding public disclosure. These agreements are legally binding under Vatican jurisdiction, meaning that even if a scholar were to release findings once they return to a different country, the Vatican could revoke all future access, impose excommunication, or issue internal disciplinary measures. The chilling effect on academic inquiry is profound. The result is a culture where information is both protected and policed, where silence is institutionalized and transparency penalized. Outside the legal structure, the administrative process itself is designed to obstruct. Scholars seeking access to the Apostolic Archive must submit formal applications that include letters of recommendation, detailed research agendas, and documentation of ecclesiastical standing. Even then, approval is not guaranteed, and when granted, it may come with temporal restrictions, page limits, and mandatory clerical supervision. Notably, entire sections of the archive remain permanently closed, with no justification offered. Some documents are classified by papal decree to remain sealed for periods of 75 to 100 years. In other cases, no expiration date is given. The Vatican reserves the right to reclassify, withdraw, or destroy materials at its discretion. No external oversight body has the authority to audit or challenge these actions. This structure of control is further shielded by the Vatican's diplomatic immunity and extraterritorial status under the Lateran Treaty of 1929. As a sovereign entity, the Holy See is not subject to Italian law or to international standards of archival openness. It is under no obligation to disclose the existence, location, or content of specific documents or physical spaces. This legal insulation enables the Church to operate as both a theological and historical authority, defining what counts as evidence and who has the right to interpret it. The Vatican's refusal to grant access cannot be litigated or appealed in any external court. The jurisdictional isolation is total. The result is an informational ecosystem in which absence cannot be interrogated. A scholar cannot prove that a document is missing if its existence is not acknowledged. A vault's contents cannot be contested if no inventory is ever released. The epistemic consequence is that historical silence becomes self-reinforcing. Without access, there is no evidence. Without evidence, there is no claim. Without a claim, there is no challenge. The system produces a vacuum where counter-narratives cannot form, let alone gain traction. This problem of gatekeeping extends beyond the specific issue of Christian history. The Vatican archives include documents related to global geopolitics, early science, indigenous knowledge, and interreligious encounters materials that could reshape conventional understandings of colonization, cultural suppression, and religious syncretism. Yet these materials remain inaccessible, either because they challenge the moral authority of the Church or because they conflict with dominant theological narratives. Control of history thus becomes a form of soft power, enabling the Vatican to participate in global memory construction without democratic accountability. Attempts to circumvent this system have been met with institutional resistance. Independent scholars who publish critical work based on leaked materials or third-party testimonies are often discredited by church-affiliated academics. Their legitimacy is undermined through credentialism, theological accusations, or appeals to authority. In more severe cases, their research is preemptively classified as conspiratorial or heretical, disqualifying it from serious consideration within mainstream academic circles. The gatekeeping function, therefore, operates not only internally, but externally, shaping public discourse through subtle mechanisms of reputation control and doctrinal framing. The architecture of restriction, legal, physical, and ideological, is coherent and deliberate. It does not merely prevent access to specific spaces or texts. It constructs an entire epistemological framework in which inquiry must conform to institutional limits. Historical investigation becomes a derivative process, subordinate to ecclesiastical permission rather than empirical discovery. The deeper the scholar attempts to probe into critical junctures of religious history, particularly those involving early doctrinal formation, heretical movements, or the origins of church authority, the more complete the institutional resistance becomes. This model of gatekeeping does not depend on secrecy alone. It thrives on selective transparency, on the strategic release of non-threatening materials to simulate openness. Periodic disclosures from the Apostolic Archive or curated archaeological findings from Vatican Hill are presented as evidence of goodwill. But these disclosures are calculated, pre-approved, and framed to reinforce official narratives. They serve not to inform, but to contain. To challenge the evidentiary black holes surrounding the Church's formative centuries requires more than the release of isolated documents. It demands a systemic dismantling of the gatekeeping mechanisms that dictate the terms of historical engagement. The problem is not simply what the Vatican hides, but how it justifies hiding as a theological virtue and institutional right. Until that foundation is interrogated, access will remain conditional, and history will remain incomplete. A complete historical record does not merely rest upon what is preserved. It is equally defined by what has been omitted, lost, or withheld. The history of religion, particularly that of early Christianity, is riddled with such absences. These are not simple gaps due to time or decay. They are voids produced by selective preservation, institutional censorship, and deliberate redaction. The Vatican's monopoly over many of the primary documents and artifacts relating to foundational religious narratives makes it a central actor in the creation and maintenance of these evidentiary black holes. To understand what has survived in the historical record, it is essential to analyze what is conspicuously absent and what mechanisms produced that absence. A survey of early Christian literature reveals a spectrum of texts that once circulated widely among diverse communities, yet are now either partially preserved, misattributed, or entirely lost. The known apocryphal Gospels, such as those attributed to Thomas, Mary Magdalene, Judas, and Philip, represent only a fraction of a once vibrant field of theological experimentation. Many of these writings offer divergent cosmologies, ethical codes, and interpretations of Christ's role that deviate sharply from the canonical four Gospels. Their marginalization was not the result of lack of relevance, but the product of ecclesiastical suppression during the consolidation of orthodoxy. These texts were labeled heretical, destroyed where possible, and excluded from scriptural collections. Today, most survive only in fragmentary form or as references in condemnatory church writings. What makes this exclusion problematic is not merely the loss of content, but the loss of context. Without the full spectrum of early Christian literature, it is impossible to reconstruct the theological diversity of the first centuries. The canonized narrative neatly structured around the Synoptic Gospels, Acts, and the Pauline epistles projects a coherence that did not exist in practice. Early Christianity was a contested space, with no single authoritative voice. The narrative of uniformity was retroactively constructed through councils, creeds, and codices designed to obscure internal dissent. The absence of many of these alternative voices has created a distorted historical lens, one that aligns with institutional objectives rather than empirical accuracy. Beyond textual omissions, there's a troubling silence surrounding key historical events in early church history. For example, the precise details of the transition from Jewish sectarian movement to Roman imperial religion remain vague. What were the socio-political negotiations that allowed a once persecuted group to align itself with imperial power? How were theological compromises brokered to make Christianity palatable to a diverse empire? Existing records speak in generalities, often couched in theological rhetoric. Concrete political transactions, moments of doctrinal bargaining, and interreligious polemics are underrepresented or absent. These absences are not accidental. They serve the purpose of smoothing over inconvenient transitions and moral ambiguities in the institutional origin story. The problem deepens when considering the absence of material culture. The early centuries of Christianity saw the development of symbols, relics, and liturgical objects that are now lost or unexplained. The sudden appearance of specific iconographies, the crucifix, the halo, the Virgin Mary in regal pose, suggests a process of symbolic engineering. Yet records detailing the development and institutionalization of these symbols are sparse. Artistic representations from the 3rd and 4th centuries show remarkable shifts in style and content that are not accompanied by corresponding theological explanations. The absence of these justifications implies a narrative reorganization, in which visual language was standardized without transparency regarding its origins. Institutional explanations often attribute these absences to time, persecution, or accidents of history. While degradation and destruction are inevitable over centuries, the pattern and selectivity of what is missing suggest intervention. Whole categories of texts and artifacts disappear while others, those that support the dominant theological line, are carefully preserved and celebrated. The conditions of preservation mirror the conditions of orthodoxy. What aligns with institutional power is retained. What threatens it is excised. The Vatican's role in this curatorial process is central. As the holder of the Apostolic Archive and custodian of the Church's physical and textual legacy, it determines what is worthy of preservation, translation, and dissemination. Access to many historical documents is granted only under strict conditions, and entire categories of information are labeled as sensitive or confidential. Scholars seeking access to pre-conciliar materials, Inquisition records, or early correspondence between ecclesiastical authorities and imperial agents often encounter refusals or heavily redacted files. In some cases, the very existence of certain documents is denied, even when referenced in earlier publications. This institutional amnesia is not a passive condition. It is a mechanism of control. The result is a historical record that appears seamless but is, in fact, discontinuous. The theological narrative from apostolic times to modern Catholicism is presented as a natural evolution, but the documentary trail contains ruptures that are patched over with assumption rather than evidence. These discontinuities are especially evident during critical junctures: the Council of Nicaea, the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, the Gregorian reforms, and the Counter-Reformation. In each case, archival material that could clarify motivations, dissenting positions, or alternative interpretations is either missing or inaccessible. This selective preservation ensures that the Church's version of history remains unchallenged by internal contradiction. Moreover, the Church's claim to universality depends on its ability to project consistency across time. Evidentiary gaps threaten that projection. If it were acknowledged that early Christianity was fragmented, that its scriptures were contested, or that its doctrinal foundations were politically negotiated, the claim to timeless truth would be undermined. The absences in the historical record thus function as supports for theological certainty. Their silence sustains the narrative. Outside observers often approach these gaps with the tools of textual criticism, archaeology, or comparative religion. Yet such tools are of limited use when the primary materials are locked behind institutional barriers or have been intentionally destroyed. The problem is not just the loss of data, but the inability to confirm what was lost. This epistemic closure transforms historical inquiry into speculation. It shifts the burden from evidence to inference, from documentation to reconstruction. And in doing so, it maintains the institutional monopoly over religious truth. A further complication arises when considering that some absences are retroactively filled with dubious content. Forged documents, interpolated texts, and anachronistic artifacts have been inserted into the historical record at various times to compensate for voids or to support emerging doctrines. These forgeries, some of which have been exposed, others still accepted, exemplify the danger of an unregulated archive. When the same institution that controls access also defines authenticity, the reliability of the historical record becomes contingent on institutional integrity. In the absence of transparency, there can be no independent verification. To investigate the evidentiary black holes in religious history is to confront a system designed to make such investigation futile. The archive of absences is not empty, it is filled with denials, omissions, and strategic silences. These silences speak volumes. They reveal where power has intervened, where history has been rewritten, and where inquiry has been arrested. Until these mechanisms are dismantled, or at least exposed, the history of religion will remain incomplete, not because the past is inaccessible, but because access is denied. The consolidation of Christian orthodoxy was not the result of organic theological evolution. It was a process defined by conflict, exclusion, and erasure. The early centuries of Christianity were marked by intense diversity of belief systems, each interpreting the nature of Jesus, God, salvation, and human existence in fundamentally different ways. Among these diverse systems, the doctrines that would later become orthodox were only one of many contenders. The suppression of alternative sects was not merely theological, it was operational. The Vatican's historical role in this suppression extends from spiritual condemnation to physical destruction, ensuring that certain ideas were buried both metaphorically and literally beneath the institutional weight of ecclesiastical authority. One of the earliest and most significant targets of suppression was Gnosticism. Gnostic communities flourished in the first 3 centuries CE, particularly in regions such as Egypt, Syria, and Asia Minor. These groups rejected the emerging institutional church's emphasis on ecclesiastical hierarchy, apostolic succession, and dogmatic uniformity. Instead, Gnostics emphasized direct, personal spiritual knowledge, gnosis, and often viewed the material world as corrupt or illusory. Their cosmologies diverged sharply from the proto-Orthodox narrative. The Creator God was not benevolent, but flawed or even malevolent, and salvation was not achieved through faith in Christ's death, but through internal awakening. These concepts undermined the institutional authority of a church, claiming to mediate salvation. The church responded to Gnostic teachings with strategic condemnation. Texts were labeled heretical, communities were declared anathema, and leaders were excommunicated or marginalized. The result was not only theological rejection, but documentary disappearance. Gnostic scriptures, once widely circulated, were systematically destroyed. Their rediscovery in the 20th century, most notably the Nag Hammadi Library in 1945, offered only a fragmented glimpse into what had been a rich tradition. These texts had to be hidden in jars and buried in desert caves to escape annihilation, indicating the extent to which institutional forces sought to obliterate alternative theological systems. The fact that they remained hidden for over a millennium underscores the success of that effort. Marcionism posed a similar threat. Marcion of Sinope, active in the mid-2nd century, proposed a radical dichotomy between the God of the Hebrew Bible and the God revealed by Jesus. According to Marcion, the Old Testament deity was a God of law, wrath, and material creation, distinct and inferior to the New Testament's God of grace and spirit. This theological model directly challenged the continuity the Church sought to establish between Jewish scriptures and Christian revelation. By rejecting the Old Testament entirely, Marcion exposed the fragility of the emerging Christian canon. His edited version of Christian scripture, which included only a modified Gospel of Luke and 10 Pauline epistles, was arguably the first formal Christian canon. The Church's response to Marcion was swift and aggressive. He was excommunicated in 144 CE, and his teachings were declared heretical in multiple subsequent councils. His version of Scripture was suppressed, and efforts were made to retrieve and destroy copies. Only through polemical writings, those intended to refute Marcion, do we glean partial insights into his theology. His absence from the preserved Christian tradition is not the result of insignificance, but of efficient eradication. Marcionite communities, once widespread, were dismantled, and their textual legacy was buried under centuries of ecclesiastical condemnation. Montanism, another early sect, posed a different kind of challenge, one of spiritual authority. Founded by Montanus in Phrygia in the late 2nd century, this movement emphasized ecstatic prophecy and claimed that divine revelation had not ceased with the apostles. Montanists believed the Holy Spirit continued to speak through chosen individuals, often bypassing established clerical structures. This assertion undermined the Church's emerging claim to be the sole mediator of divine will. The movement included prominent women as prophetic voices, further destabilizing patriarchal hierarchies. Although not doctrinally divergent from orthodoxy in all aspects, Montanism's threat lay in its decentralization of authority. The Church responded by branding it as excessive, fanatical, and dangerous. Montanist writings were suppressed, prophetic practices were banned, and followers were excluded from ecclesiastical life. Over time, their traditions were forgotten, and their contributions to Christian mysticism and ecclesiology were erased from the dominant narrative. The vaults of the Vatican likely contain materials, liturgical, epistolary, or doctrinal from such groups, locked away under classifications that reduced their significance to heresy. The process of suppression was not confined to textual censorship. It extended to physical spaces and artifacts. Churches built by dissident sects were either destroyed or reconsecrated. Burial grounds were defiled, and relics associated with heretical leaders were confiscated or hidden. The control of sacred geography was central to enforcing theological uniformity. By denying physical markers of alternative Christianities, the Church could rewrite the landscape in its own image. Vatican Hill itself, as the center of orthodoxy, likely contains beneath its surface the traces of suppressed traditions, ritual, objects, inscriptions, or remains that challenge the singularity of the Church's narrative. The councils played a key role in formalizing suppression. Nicaea, 325 CE, Constantinople, 381 C, Ephesus, 431 CE, and Chalcedon, 451 CE, were not simply theological debates. They were political maneuvers aimed at defining orthodoxy through exclusion. Teachings not ratified at these councils were declared heretical, and their followers were systematically marginalized. The decisions made at these gatherings were enforced with imperial support, turning theological differences into matters of state security. This fusion of church and empire created a machinery of doctrinal enforcement capable of reshaping not just beliefs, but memory itself. That machinery required record-keeping, not to preserve dissent, but to eliminate it. Heresiological literature, such as the writings of Irenaeus, Tertullian, and Epiphanius, functioned as tools of surveillance. They catalogued deviant beliefs, identified their proponents, and prescribed theological countermeasures. Ironically, these polemics are now among the only surviving sources for many alternative traditions. They are biased, incomplete, and often deliberately distorted. Yet they are all that remain because the primary texts were destroyed, and their existence was erased from official archives. In examining what is left, the disproportion becomes clear. The preserved theological record overwhelmingly favors those who won the battle for orthodoxy. That record is housed, guarded, and curated by an institution whose very identity is tied to the legitimacy of its version of history, the Vatican's. Control over ancient manuscripts, archaeological sites, and sealed vaults means that any lingering evidence of suppressed sects remains beyond reach. The erasure of these communities is not total, but it is close engineered through centuries of theological gatekeeping. political alignment, and institutional opacity. The question is no longer whether heresies were buried, but how thoroughly and whether recovery is still possible. The evidentiary black holes left by this process are not just gaps in knowledge. They are the product of intentional suppression, of a campaign to define what Christianity was, by destroying what it could have been. Until full access is granted to the physical and textual remains of these erased theologies, the history of religion remains an edited version of itself curated for continuity, not for truth. The transformation of Christianity from a persecuted sect to the ideological backbone of the Roman Empire was not an organic development, but a calculated reconfiguration driven by state interests. Central to this transformation was Emperor Constantine the Great, whose conversion to Christianity and subsequent policy initiatives initiated a fundamental realignment of power, theology, and historical memory. Constantine's political motivations were not veiled in religious devotion, but rather embedded in the practical need for imperial unity. Through his actions, the structural foundations of what would become Catholic orthodoxy were formed not through consensus or spiritual revelation, but through imperial decree and strategic exclusion. This foundational moment redefined the nature of Christian truth and determined what would be remembered, what would be codified, and what would be forgotten. The Edict of Milan in 313 CE, co-authored by Constantine and Licinius, is often celebrated as the milestone of religious tolerance. In practice, however, it marked the beginning of state-mediated Christianity. The legalization of Christianity allowed for the rapid expansion of church infrastructure and patronage, but it also subjected Christian doctrine to imperial scrutiny. With Constantine's support, the Church gained access to resources, land, and institutional legitimacy transformations that required doctrinal stability. Unity of faith became a matter of political necessity, and with it came the suppression of heterodox positions that threatened cohesion. The First Council of Nicaea, in 325 CE, convened by Constantine, stands as a pivotal example of imperial theology. The council's primary objective was to resolve the Arian controversy, specifically whether Jesus Christ was of the same substance, homoousios, as God the Father, or of a similar but subordinate nature. While this question was framed in theological terms, its implications were deeply political. The disagreement had already caused significant unrest in the eastern provinces. A divided church meant a divided empire. Constantine's intervention sought not truth but stability. The council's decision to condemn Arianism and endorse the Nicene Creed was enforced with the power of the state. Heretical bishops were exiled. Their writings were burned. Their congregations were dismantled. The result was a uniform theology imposed by fiat. The implications of this event were far-reaching. The establishment of orthodoxy through imperial decree created a model in which theological truth was no longer subject to communal discernment or scriptural interpretation alone. It now required alignment with political authority. This conflation of ecclesiastical and imperial power had profound effects on historical record-keeping. Alternative doctrines, previously part of open theological discourse, became threats to order and were systematically erased from institutional memory. The Vatican's subsequent control over archives, canons, and vaults is a continuation of this Constantine-era logic. Protect the core by excising the margin. Constantine's architectural initiatives further illustrate his role in reshaping religious history. The construction of the original St. Peter's Basilica atop Vatican Hill was not only a religious gesture, but a symbolic act of spatial domination. It linked the emperor directly to apostolic succession and embedded the authority of the Church within the geography of Rome. This move simultaneously sanctified the imperial project and neutralized competing Christian traditions that lacked such physical monuments. By elevating one version of history in stone, others were rendered invisible. The archaeological layers beneath the basilica, which include pagan cemeteries and possibly alternative Christian worship sites, remain under strict control, suggesting that the narrative Constantine inscribed into the landscape is still being protected. Another example of Constantine's manipulative legacy is the creation of the Church's legal authority to define heresy and punish deviation. The formation of episcopal courts with imperial backing allowed for the prosecution of dissenters as not only spiritual deviants but enemies of the state. This judicial apparatus laid the groundwork for future inquisitions, censorship, and theological policing. It also enabled the erasure of dissenting records. Once a text or belief was classified as heretical, it could be legally seized, destroyed, or concealed. The pattern of suppression that began under Constantine became the institutional reflex of church governance. The long-term effects of Constantine's interference are evident in the shaping of the biblical canon. Although the canon was not finalized during his reign, the process was heavily influenced by the theological climate he engineered. Writings that aligned with Nicene orthodoxy were copied, disseminated, and preserved. Others, those that bore traces of Gnostic, Arian, or Docetic influence, were discarded or anathematized. Constantine commissioned 50 copies of the scriptures for the churches of Constantinople, effectively establishing a template for canonical texts. These copies, now lost, would have solidified a version of Christianity that reflected imperial priorities rather than theological plurality. The absence of their content from historical analysis further underscores the evidentiary gaps engineered during this era. The silence surrounding Constantine's political manipulation of religion is reinforced by the Vatican's reluctance to release archival materials from this period. While official church histories emphasize Constantine's piety and the divine guidance of the councils he convened, critical documentation that might reveal dissent, manipulation, or resistance is either unavailable or classified. Letters, meeting transcripts, and alternative council records are largely inaccessible to independent scholars. This omission is not incidental. It protects the foundational myth of divine guidance and ecclesiastical purity, shielding it from historical challenge. Moreover, Constantine's legacy of doctrinal enforcement through imperial power extended beyond his lifetime. Successive emperors followed his model, leveraging theological decisions to consolidate control. Councils such as Constantinople and Chalcedon continued the trend of defining orthodoxy through exclusion, often using imperial troops to enforce compliance. These decisions, too, are enshrined in church tradition, while the dissenting voices, Nestorians, Monophysites, and others, are relegated to footnotes, often stripped of contextual nuance and theological depth. The historical record reflects not a dialogue but a purge, its remnants shaped by those who won. The Vatican's role in preserving this Constantine-driven model is not passive. Its archives, libraries, and restricted vaults contain documents that likely detail the negotiations, compromises, and coercions of early church councils. Their continued suppression sustains the illusion of doctrinal continuity. To release them would invite questions about the authenticity of the Church's foundational claims. It would expose the degree to which theology was molded by empire, and how power, not revelation, was the engine of orthodoxy. Understanding Constantine's impact is essential for any investigation into the evidentiary black holes of religious history. His reign marks the point at which spiritual authority was formally yoked to political calculation. From that point forward, historical memory was no longer a matter of communal experience, but of institutional control. The Church, empowered by the state, became the arbiter of what could be known, what should be forgotten, and what must be buried. The vaults beneath Vatican Hill are not merely repositories. They are monuments to this foundational moment of transformation, where the calculus of empire reshaped the meaning of divine truth. The foundational narrative of the Roman Catholic Church rests upon the figure of St. Peter as the first pope and the original cornerstone of apostolic authority. The institutional claim that Peter was martyred in Rome and buried beneath what is now St. Peter's Basilica undergirds the Vatican's theological and political centrality. This narrative, however, is constructed upon a foundation riddled with historical inconsistencies, ambiguous textual references, and archaeological uncertainties. The story of Peter's life, mission, death, and burial site has been shaped more by institutional need than empirical certainty. The elevation of Peter to the status of Rome's first bishop and his alleged burial beneath Vatican Hill is not an established historical fact. It is a constructed tradition whose legitimacy depends on selective interpretation and inaccessible evidence. Scriptural references to Peter provide no definitive account of his presence in Rome. The New Testament does not state explicitly that Peter ever traveled to the imperial capital. The Acts of the Apostles, which details the missionary activities of early Christian leaders, is notably silent on Peter's movements after chapter 15. While Paul's letters mention Peter, Cephas, they do not confirm his location in Rome. 1 Peter 5:13 makes a cryptic reference to Babylon, which has been retroactively interpreted as a coded reference to Rome, but this remains speculative. The absence of clear biblical testimony raises questions about the historical basis for Peter's Roman mission, especially considering the centrality of that claim to papal authority. The earliest Christian writers do little to clarify this ambiguity. Clement of Rome, writing near the end of the 1st century, references Peter and Paul's martyrdom, but does not specify the location of Peter's burial. Ignatius of Antioch and Irenaeus of Lyons, both 2nd century sources, affirm Peter's presence in Rome, but their statements are more theological than evidentiary. They serve to establish the city's spiritual importance rather than to document verifiable events. The historical Peter, if he did indeed die in Rome, left no first-hand writings, no confirmed burial site, and no contemporaneous records linking him definitively to Vatican Hill. Despite this lack of clarity, the Church constructed an increasingly elaborate narrative over the centuries, one that positioned Peter not only in Rome, but as the first bishop of the city and the ultimate source of apostolic succession. This narrative reached its apex with the physical construction of St. Peter's Basilica in the 4th century under Constantine. The claim that the church was built atop Peter's tomb gave material form to theological assertion. Yet the archaeological basis for this claim remains contested. Excavations conducted beneath the basilica in the 1940s discovered a necropolis, multiple burial chambers, and an inscribed wall that some interpret as evidence of a Peter-related cult. However, the identification of one particular tomb as Peter's remains unproven. The Vatican's management of this excavation raises significant concerns about transparency. The digs were conducted under strict secrecy, supervised by clerics, and only select findings were published. The bones found in one of the tombs, initially declared unrelated, were later reconsidered and announced in the 1960s as possibly belonging to Peter. Yet the chain of custody, the scientific methodology, and the comparative analysis were all shielded from independent verification. Experts who questioned the conclusion were marginalized or denied access to the evidence. The institution had reached its theological conclusion and adapted the archaeological interpretation to match it. Inconsistencies extend beyond the issue of location. The very title of Bishop of Rome applied to Peter is an anachronism. In the 1st century, the Church had no centralized episcopal structure. Leadership was communal, fluid, and varied by region. The notion of a singular head of the universal Church based in one city did not emerge until well after Peter's death, assuming he died in Rome at all. Retrofitting Peter into this later structure served to legitimize the growing power of the Roman episcopate. By projecting contemporary hierarchies backward onto apostolic figures, the Church constructed a lineage that did not exist in the early decades of Christianity. This retrospective construction becomes even more problematic when considering the competing claims of other Christian centers. Antioch, Alexandria and Jerusalem also traced their ecclesiastical heritage to apostolic founders. These cities developed theological schools, episcopal traditions, and independent liturgical identities. The elevation of Rome above them required a justification that was not historical but symbolic. Peter's supposed martyrdom in Rome served that purpose. It provided the spiritual capital needed to subordinate other traditions and centralize authority in the West. The apostolic ambiguity was not resolved, it was overwritten. The theological importance of Peter was further elevated through doctrines such as ex cathedra authority and papal infallibility. These later developments, especially the declaration at the First Vatican Council in 1870, cemented Peter's role as the eternal prototype of the Pope. Yet these doctrines relied not on historical evidence, but on interpretive tradition. They used Scripture selectively, most notably Matthew 16:18, where Jesus says, "You are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church." This passage has been the subject of extensive exegetical debate. Even within early Christian writings, there was no consensus that it established a literal papal office. The passage's elevation to institutional dogma reflects the needs of the Church rather than the clarity of the text. The lack of corroboration for Peter's Roman leadership is further complicated by the simultaneous tradition of Paul's martyrdom. In Rome, while Paul's presence in the capital is more textually supported, his role in church hierarchy was always less institutionalized. The Church's choice to emphasize Peter over Paul in its Rome-centric model reflects not theological consistency, but administrative utility. Peter could be depicted as the obedient shepherd, the holder of keys, the earthly foundation. Paul, with his autonomous theology and contentious relationships with church leaders, was less conducive to hierarchical modeling. The convergence of weak textual evidence, controlled archaeology, and retrospective theological projection forms a triad of ambiguity around Peter's origins and burial. The Vatican's refusal to allow unrestricted academic investigation of the necropolis beneath the Basilica perpetuates this ambiguity. Any claim that rests on hidden evidence cannot be independently assessed. The Church's insistence on Peter's tomb being beneath Vatican Hill becomes not an invitation to inquiry, but a barrier to it. The implications of this constructed narrative are immense. If Peter's Roman leadership is uncertain, then the foundation of the papal office as a direct apostolic continuation becomes unstable. Apostolic succession loses its empirical anchor, and the Vatican's claim to be the singular earthly authority of Christ's Church becomes a theological assertion without demonstrable historical support. This is not a minor inconsistency, it is a foundational rupture concealed beneath centuries of doctrinal reinforcement and architectural grandeur. The investigation into Peter's true historical role and final resting place remains obstructed by layers of institutional narrative and physical inaccessibility. As long as the Church maintains exclusive control over the sites and sources that could clarify or contradict its claims, apostolic ambiguity will persist not as an open question for scholarship, but as a protected dogma immune to revision. The Church does not merely inherit Peter's authority, it controls the conditions under which his story may be told. One of the most powerful constructs in the historical self-understanding of the Roman Catholic Church is the notion of unbroken apostolic succession. This doctrine asserts that every pope from Peter to the present day occupies a continuous chain of divinely authorized leadership, each one succeeding the previous in a seamless line stretching back to Christ's commissioning of Peter. This narrative is essential to the Church's claim of doctrinal authority and institutional legitimacy. Yet when scrutinized against the available historical evidence, the lineage reveals significant discontinuities, retroactive constructions, and outright fabrications. The idea of a coherent and linear genealogy of papal power is less a fact than a theological instrument. engineered to support the consolidation of ecclesiastical control. Early Christian communities did not operate under a papal model. Leadership was decentralized, often based on collective councils of elders or charismatic figures rather than a single overseer. The terminology itself was fluid. Terms like bishop, presbyter, and deacon were used interchangeably and did not denote rigid hierarchies. It was only by the mid-2nd century that the role of a monarchical bishop began to appear in Rome, and even then, the authority of that office was limited to the local congregation. Claims that Peter served as the first bishop of Rome are anachronistic. There is no contemporary documentation supporting this assertion. Lists of bishops provided in later sources, such as Irenaeus Against Heresies, are more theological constructs than historical records. Designed to establish continuity rather than report it, these episcopal lists exhibit notable discrepancies. Different early Christian writers provide varying names, lengths of tenure, and sequences. Eusebius of Caesarea, the first to systematize a bishop list in his ecclesiastical history in the 4th century, did so under the patronage of Constantine, during the same period that the Church was attempting to formalize its doctrinal and institutional authority. Eusebius himself admits that his sources were fragmented and sometimes contradictory. The list he provides, later adopted into official church doctrine, omits several figures found in other traditions and appears to have been curated for ideological coherence. The assumption that these early leaders shared the same office, title, and ecclesial function as modern popes is historically unsustainable. The Vatican's perpetuation of this seamless lineage is reinforced through iconography, ritual, and selective historiography. Papal installations include references to the unbroken chain from Peter. Official Vatican publications treat the succession as indisputable. Yet the gaps in the historical record are substantial. During the 3rd century, periods of civil unrest and persecution disrupted the leadership of the Church in Rome. In some cases, there were multiple claimants to the papacy, while in others, the see remained vacant for extended periods. These interregna are glossed over in institutional accounts, which portray them as moments of continuity rather than rupture. The issue becomes even more problematic during times of schism. The Western Schism, 1378 to 1417, in which multiple individuals simultaneously claimed to be the legitimate pope, created a fissure that no retrospective list can coherently resolve. The Avignon papacy further complicates the succession narrative, as for nearly 70 years, the papal seat was moved from Rome to France, raising questions about jurisdiction, authority, and continuity. Vatican historiography has attempted to retroactively select legitimate popes while discarding antipopes, but this selection process is inherently political. The inclusion or exclusion of specific figures depends not on historical consensus, but on institutional needs. These inconsistencies are not simply matters of administrative confusion. They directly undermine the theological premise of apostolic succession. If the chain can be broken, contested, or retroactively corrected, then its authority cannot be intrinsic. The idea that divine authority was passed down in an unbroken line becomes a myth, sustained not by evidence but by repetition. The Vatican's insistence on this narrative, despite the historical contradictions, reflects a commitment to institutional legitimacy rather than empirical truth. The archives of the Vatican contain materials that could potentially clarify the gaps in papal succession, including correspondences, conciliar records, and administrative documents from disputed periods. Yet access to these materials is highly restricted. The Vatican Apostolic Archive selectively releases information based on internal classification systems. For centuries, documents pertaining to papal elections, doctrinal conflicts, and schismatic movements have remained sealed or only partially available. The reasoning provided often cites concerns over scandal, misinterpretation, or ecclesiastical decorum. The result is a controlled historical environment in which continuity is asserted, but not demonstrated. This environment is reinforced through ceremonial and architectural means. The papal tombs beneath St. Peter's Basilica, arranged to emphasize unbroken succession, are presented as visual confirmations of the lineage. However, many of these tombs were reconstructed centuries after the deaths of the individuals they commemorate. The actual burial locations of several early popes are unknown, and the attributions are based on later tradition rather than archaeological evidence. The physical narrative thus mirrors the textual one, constructed to project stability where instability existed. Even more concerning is the practice of retroactively assigning papal attributes to figures who never claimed or exercised such roles. Early bishops who led local congregations without any universal authority are portrayed as exercising powers equivalent to those of contemporary popes. The doctrine of papal infallibility, declared only in 1870, is projected backward onto figures who operated in entirely different ecclesial contexts. This retrospective elevation serves to homogenize a diverse and evolving institution into a single, consistent entity. The problem is epistemological as much as historical. The Church presents its genealogy not as a hypothesis but as a fact. It teaches the papal lineage as an article of faith, unchallengeable within the confines of ecclesiastical discourse. This approach forecloses critical inquiry and renders historical revision impossible without undermining foundational claims. The continuity is declared, not demonstrated. Dissent is framed as heretical or revisionist, rather than as a legitimate scholarly response to conflicting evidence. In the broader context of religious history, the myth of papal continuity reflects a common strategy to construct an uninterrupted past that legitimizes present authority. This strategy relies on suppressing complexity, erasing dissent, and privileging institutional narratives over conflicting sources. The Vatican's control over the material record, its ability to decide which documents are accessible, which artifacts are displayed, and which accounts are canonized, ensures that this strategy remains effective until the full documentary record is open to critical scrutiny, and until historical claims are subjected to independent verification. The story of unbroken papal succession remains a theological assertion rather than a historical conclusion. The gaps, contradictions, and ambiguities in the record suggest not a continuous chain, but a reconstructed one piece together to serve an institution that benefits from projecting an image of eternal stability. The legitimacy of that image depends on the concealment of the breaks that define it, the recorded history of early Christianity, and the broader religious milieu from which it emerged, was once sustained by a diverse and expansive manuscript tradition. Scrolls, codices, letters, treatises, and theological commentaries circulated widely across the Mediterranean and Near Eastern worlds. These texts captured not only doctrinal variations but also regional practices, dissenting voices, and alternative cosmologies. Today, however, the corpus available to historians is a fraction of what once existed. A vast array of manuscripts has either disappeared, been destroyed, or remains locked away in institutional custody. Nowhere is this phenomenon more acute or more opaque than within the holdings of the Vatican, an entity that simultaneously claims custodianship over the world's most comprehensive religious archive and maintains severe restrictions on its content. Process of scriptural canonization, which culminated in the 4th and 5th centuries, played a central role in determining which texts would survive and which would be discarded. The establishment of the New Testament canon did not follow a divinely revealed pattern but rather evolved through political negotiation, ecclesiastical lobbying, and regional consensus building. As the canon solidified, non-canonical works were labeled as apocryphal or heretical, and efforts to suppress them intensified. While some of these texts survived in monastic libraries or hidden caches, the majority were lost. Manuscripts that did not align with the emergent orthodoxy were systematically excluded from copying traditions, banned by ecclesiastical decree, or physically destroyed. The Index of Forbidden Books, formalized centuries later, merely institutionalized a practice that had already been operative for centuries. Among the most notable categories of missing manuscripts are those that belong to early Gnostic and semi-Gnostic communities. The discovery of the Nag Hammadi Library in 1945 illuminated this dark corner of textual history, revealing a trove of once suppressed literature. These codices containing the Gospel of Thomas, the Apocryphon of John, the Gospel of Truth, and others demonstrate that early Christianity was not a unified movement, but a multiplicity of theological streams. The presence of these documents in a buried jar in the Egyptian desert testifies not to casual neglect, but to deliberate concealment, likely in response to intensified efforts by church authorities to eradicate unapproved teachings. These were not obscure or marginal communities. Their writings show philosophical sophistication and theological innovation. Their elimination from the historical record was a strategic act of doctrinal consolidation. Other critical manuscripts vanished through mechanisms less visible but no less decisive. Early Christian letters mentioned by church fathers no longer exist, despite being cited as authoritative. Lost commentaries on the Hebrew Scriptures, alternative genealogies of Jesus, and regional liturgies with theological implications have left only faint traces in hostile polemics. In some cases, scholars are aware of the titles and even partial contents of these texts from secondary sources, yet the originals remain missing. The lack of transparency about their fate, whether they were destroyed, hidden, or remain unreleased, in ecclesiastical custody sustains the problem of evidentiary black holes. The Vatican's control over ancient manuscripts is pivotal in this context. The Vatican Apostolic Library contains an immense collection of handwritten works spanning millennia. Among its holdings are uncatalogued codices, untranslated scrolls, and fragile fragments from the early Christian period. Many of these have not been subjected to scholarly review, either because access is restricted or because their contents are classified as sensitive. While the library has made some gestures toward openness, digitizing select manuscripts and offering limited access to credentialed researchers, the core remains inaccessible. Entire genres of texts, particularly those touching on early theological controversy or interreligious exchange, are effectively off-limits. This inaccessibility perpetuates ignorance under the guise of preservation. The issue extends beyond Christian texts. Manuscripts from Jewish, Islamic, Zoroastrian, and pre-Christian pagan traditions that interacted with early Christian thought also reside in the Vatican's vaults. These materials could shed light on the intellectual crosscurrents of late antiquity, clarifying how ideas migrated, transformed, or were co-opted. Yet comparative studies are impeded by the Vatican's refusal to release these documents to non-church authorities. The knowledge that remains locked within these vaults is not only theological, it is historical, anthropological, and epistemic. There's also the question of the so-called hidden Gospels texts rumored to be stored within the Vatican, but never confirmed. These include alternative versions of known Gospels and entirely unknown writings attributed to figures such as Bartholomew, Nicodemus, and James. While some of these claims are speculative, others are rooted in historical citations by early church writers who reference documents now lost. The cumulative effect is a widespread suspicion that the Vatican possesses, but does not disclose, manuscripts that could radically reframe the early Christian narrative. The Church's position on such claims has been consistently non-committal, neither confirming nor denying possession, thereby maintaining control over both the materials and the discourse surrounding them. The case of the Gospel of Barnabas exemplifies this dynamic. While versions of this text exist outside Vatican custody, its treatment illustrates how control over manuscripts is exercised. The Gospel presents a version of Jesus aligned more closely with Islamic theology than Christian doctrine, including a denial of the crucifixion and a rejection of divinity. Western church authorities have labeled it a forgery without allowing full scholarly examination of its manuscript lineage. Accusations of fabrication are not necessarily unwarranted, but the lack of transparency fuels distrust. If independent verification is blocked, then claims of inauthenticity remain self-reinforcing. In several documented cases, scholars have reported seeing references to manuscripts in Vatican catalogs that were later removed or reclassified. These include works listed in 19th century inventories that no longer appear in current databases. Requests for clarification are typically met with silence or redirection. The criteria for access are neither public nor consistent. Appeals based on academic merit are frequently overridden by theological sensitivity. The implication is that manuscript control is not about fragility, conservation, or logistics. It is about narrative sovereignty. Furthermore, the Vatican has periodically released select ancient documents to support its preferred historical narratives. These releases are curated to affirm orthodoxy, demonstrate scholarly goodwill, or respond to external pressure. But they are never comprehensive, and they rarely address areas of historical controversy. This selective disclosure maintains an asymmetry of information that protects the Church's interpretive monopoly. While some texts are displayed in exhibitions or digitized for limited academic use, the most potentially destabilizing materials remain classified. This dynamic raises fundamental questions about the ethics of custodianship. Should any institution, religious or otherwise, have the authority to unilaterally determine the accessibility of texts with global historical significance? The Vatican's position as both theological authority and archival gatekeeper places it in a unique position to curate history itself. The locked codices are not just relics of the past. They are instruments of present power, shaping what can be known, what can be questioned, and what remains beyond the reach of inquiry. Until these manuscripts are fully released, examined, and contextualized within the broader history of religious thought, the story of early Christianity and of the diverse traditions it intersected with remains incomplete. The silence of these texts is not neutral. It is a product of decisions made in the corridors of power, behind the sealed doors of an institution that continues to define truth through exclusion. The scrolls that once spoke across cultures and centuries now speak only through their absence, held in custody by a church that refuses to let them be heard. The Society of Jesus, more commonly known as the Jesuits, was founded in the 16th century, with the stated purpose of defending and propagating the Catholic faith. While often associated with education, missionary work, and intellectual rigor, the Jesuit order has also played a significant role in the management, control, and sometimes suppression of knowledge, both religious and secular. Acting as the Church's intellectual vanguard, Jesuits have operated across continents, languages, and disciplines, often shaping the boundaries of permissible inquiry. Their contributions to science and scholarship are undeniable, but so too is their deep entanglement with censorship, surveillance, and archival gatekeeping. Within the broader Vatican apparatus, the Jesuit order has historically served as both a repository and a regulator of information, functioning as a custodian not only of learning but of sanctioned ignorance. The global reach of the Jesuit order, particularly during the Counter-Reformation and the subsequent colonial expansions of Europe, positioned them as gatekeepers of cultural and religious knowledge. In Asia, Africa, and the Americas, Jesuit missionaries recorded local customs, beliefs, and histories, sometimes with anthropological precision, but almost always with the aim of conversion and theological control. The information gathered in these contexts was not freely disseminated. Reports, letters, and manuscripts were routed through the Roman Curia and often deposited in the Archivum Romanum Societatis, IESU, a Jesuit-run archive in Rome that remains one of the most restricted research institutions in the world. The Jesuits' role in collecting indigenous knowledge must be understood within this dual function: preservation and filtration. Local traditions, oral histories, and cosmologies were documented, translated, and sometimes even admired, but only insofar as they could be subordinated to Christian doctrine. Elements incompatible with Catholic theology were either omitted or reframed to fit into evangelizing strategies. In this way, entire epistemologies were absorbed and silenced simultaneously. The Jesuits became curators of a knowledge system in which foreign truths were neutralized through interpretive dominance. Within Europe, the Jesuits also exercised control over the production and circulation of theological and scientific texts. Their involvement in the education system gave them disproportionate influence over what was taught and how. They founded hundreds of colleges and universities where they set curricula, censored texts, and regulated philosophical discourse. Figures who deviated from accepted orthodoxy, whether in matters of theology or natural science, were often brought under scrutiny by Jesuit authorities. Their influence over the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, the Church's list of banned books, was considerable. They participated in identifying subversive works and authors, sometimes leading to excommunications, forced recantations, or manuscript seizures. A notable example of Jesuit interference in the domain of knowledge is their complex relationship with Galileo Galilei. While the Jesuits were among the first to engage with Galileo's astronomical observations, they ultimately played a role in reinforcing the Church's rejection of heliocentrism. Jesuit astronomers initially praised his discoveries, but as Galileo's findings began to challenge scriptural interpretations, the order aligned more closely with ecclesiastical authority. Jesuit scholars were instrumental in framing the debate in terms that favored theological orthodoxy over empirical observation. The eventual trial and condemnation of Galileo were not orchestrated by the Jesuits directly, but their intellectual framing helped narrow the space in which dissent could operate. The order's relationship with the Vatican Apostolic Archive is also significant. Jesuits have held key curatorial and administrative roles within the archive, shaping cataloging practices, access protocols, and document classification. Their internal archives, including RC, contain extensive documentation on global missionary activity, theological debates, and institutional decisions that have never been made publicly available. While some Jesuit documents have been released in recent decades, a substantial portion remains inaccessible. These materials include correspondences with popes, reports on colonial engagements, records of internal doctrinal disputes, and notes on interactions with other religious traditions. Their retention in private holdings reinforces the Jesuits' dual role as scholars and censors. Control over knowledge also extended to manuscript production. Jesuit scribes were responsible for producing official copies of conciliar decrees, papal bulls, and theological treatises. In this process, they exercised editorial discretion, often removing controversial annotations or standardizing language to reflect orthodoxy. This activity was particularly relevant during the post-Tridentine period, when the Church sought to purify its doctrinal record and eliminate ambiguity. The role of the Jesuits in sanitizing texts has left an imprint on the historical record, a smoothing over of conflict, dissent, and interpretive diversity. In more recent history, the Jesuits have continued to manage the boundaries of religious knowledge. Their engagement with liberation theology in Latin America, for example, has been deeply ambivalent. While some Jesuits supported radical reinterpretations of Christian doctrine in the context of poverty and oppression, others worked to suppress these movements or redirect them toward more institutionally palatable forms. Vatican crackdowns on liberation theologians often involved Jesuit intermediaries who mediated between radical clergy and central authorities. The result has been the containment of potentially transformative religious ideas within the institutional limits of acceptable doctrine. The Jesuits' intellectual flexibility has enabled them to adapt to shifting political and theological landscapes. They have positioned themselves as mediators between modernity and tradition, science and faith, East and West. Yet this flexibility has often served to preserve the core structures of authority rather than challenge them. Their role in information control is not merely historical, it is ongoing. As digitization projects increase, Jesuits are frequently involved in determining which materials are prioritized, translated, or withheld. Their institutions, publications, and networks continue to influence which narratives are amplified and which are neglected. The ethical implications of this role are profound. When an institution defines itself as the steward of truth, its decisions about what to reveal and what to conceal acquire theological weight. The Jesuits' control over knowledge has often been framed as a defense of the faith, but it functions just as effectively as a defense against transparency. In practice, their activities have contributed to the maintenance of epistemic asymmetry, a condition in which the Church knows what it chooses not to share, and outsiders cannot even formulate questions about what remains hidden. The custodianship of the Jesuits must therefore be understood not simply as scholarly or pastoral, but as strategic. Their influence over documents, ideas, and interpretations constitutes a powerful form of institutional memory management. They curate not only what is known, but what can be known. In the vaults beneath Vatican Hill and in the restricted archives, under Jesuit supervision, lie the suppressed margins of religious history, traces of dissent, complexity, and contradiction that remain sealed behind layers of theological, political, and bureaucratic insulation. The role of the Jesuits in constructing and defending these boundaries illustrates the institutional mechanisms through which ignorance is cultivated and maintained. It is not the absence of knowledge, but the presence of barriers to knowledge that defines this form of control. The Jesuits, as agents of both inquiry and suppression, stand at the heart of this paradox, custodians not of truth alone, but of silence. The suppression of religious and philosophical dissent throughout Christian history did not occur solely through theological argument or administrative marginalization. It manifested most visibly and violently in the systematic destruction of texts and the enforcement of intellectual conformity through institutionalized censorship. From the early Church to the modern Vatican, this drive to erase heterodox voices has produced extensive absences in the documentary record, absences that are not accidental, but the result of deliberate action. Central to this machinery was the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, a mechanism through which the Church sought to control access to written knowledge, and the coordinated use of book burnings and purges to physically eliminate threats to ecclesiastical authority. Long before the formal creation of the Index, the destruction of dangerous texts was a strategy used by church authorities to enforce orthodoxy. Early councils condemned not only heretical doctrines, but also the physical objects, books, scrolls, and even personal notes that contained them. By the 4th century, under the influence of imperial Christianity, the practice became state policy. The Emperor Theodosius I, under pressure from the Church, issued edicts banning and destroying pagan texts, temples, and rituals. These early purges targeted not only religious documents, but entire systems of knowledge. Works on cosmology, medicine, and philosophy associated with non-Christian traditions were lost en masse. Incinerations sanctioned by clerics and enforced by imperial soldiers. The formalization of ecclesiastical censorship culminated with the establishment of the Index Librorum Prohibitorum by the Sacred Congregation of the Roman Inquisition in 1559. This list codified which books Catholics were forbidden to read, possess, or distribute under threat of excommunication. It included not only explicitly anti-Christian or heretical works, but also scientific treatises, political commentaries, and philosophical tracts that conflicted with church teachings. The reach of the index extended beyond theology into every area of intellectual life, creating an environment in which knowledge was evaluated not for its truth or utility but for its compatibility with doctrine. Many significant authors found their works either listed or preemptively censored: Copernicus, Galileo, Descartes, Hobbes, Spinoza, and later Kant and Darwin. The logic of the index was not limited to defending faith. It sought to defend a worldview in which the Church remained the arbiter of truth across all domains. Works challenging geocentrism, natural law theory, human sexuality, political sovereignty, and scriptural interpretation were systematically banned. In doing so, the Church ensured that intellectual developments threatening its authority were either stifled at the source or denied. Broad circulation. Book burnings were a public and theatrical extension of this censorship. They were not isolated events, but recurring rituals of purification. During the Counter-Reformation, book burnings accompanied inquisitorial campaigns, reinforcing the message that some forms of knowledge were inherently corrupt and contagious. In cities across Europe, Rome, Paris, Lisbon, Madrid, and others, piles of books deemed heretical were set ablaze in public squares, often accompanied by sermons and symbolic condemnations. These acts destroyed not only copies of specific works but, in many cases, entire categories of intellectual production, particularly those from dissident sects, non-Christian traditions, or early scientific disciplines. The Inquisition's role in orchestrating these purges cannot be overstated. Its tribunals did not merely adjudicate theological disputes, they investigated reading habits, interrogated private libraries, and monitored intellectual correspondence. Clergy, scholars, and laypersons alike were subject to scrutiny. Confiscated. Books were destroyed, marked, or sequestered in ecclesiastical libraries under strict supervision. Some texts were corrected and reissued with doctrinal alterations, while others vanished altogether. The result was an epistemological landscape reshaped by fear, in which the pursuit of knowledge could lead to imprisonment, forced recantation, or death. While some of these texts were later rehabilitated or reinterpreted, the damage was irreversible. Generations of thinkers were deterred from inquiry, certain fields of study stagnated, and the intellectual history of Europe became a filtered narrative selectively curated by the custodians of orthodoxy. The Vatican's position in this process was not peripheral, it was central. As the administrative and symbolic core of Catholic authority, it maintained both the theological rationale and the bureaucratic infrastructure for intellectual suppression. The Vatican's internal records, particularly those within the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, formerly the Holy Office, contain documentation on the censorship process, lists of banned authors, internal memos on controversial ideas, correspondences with inquisitorial authorities, and reports on confiscated materials. However, access to many of these records remains limited. Scholars are permitted to review certain sanitized selections, but the full scope of Vatican censorship practices, particularly the rationale for specific decisions, the identities of informants, and the fate of confiscated materials, remains obscured. This partial transparency allows the Church to project an image of openness while maintaining operational control over its historical narrative. One of the enduring effects of these practices is the disappearance of entire intellectual trajectories. Early Christian sects such as the Ebionites, Montanists, and Valentinians produced writings now known only through hostile references. Medieval mystics who offered unorthodox views on salvation and the nature of God were often posthumously condemned. Their works removed from monastic libraries or destroyed outright. Renaissance philosophers exploring syncretism, humanism, or proto-scientific ideas were similarly silenced. These gaps in the record are not simply unfortunate losses, they are structural consequences of a system that weaponized information control. In the modern era, The Index Librorum Prohibitorum was officially abolished in 1966, but its legacy persists. The mechanisms of censorship have evolved into more discrete forms: access restrictions, doctrinal reviews, and institutional discouragement of controversial scholarship. The Church no longer publicly burns books, but it maintains doctrinal boundaries that shape what is published in Catholic institutions, seminaries, and affiliated academic journals. The Vatican continues to monitor theological innovation, intervening when interpretations drift too far from established norms. In this way, the spirit of the Index survives even as its explicit list has been retired. The cumulative effect of centuries of censorship is not merely the loss of individual works, but the distortion of intellectual history itself. What survives is not an organic record of inquiry and development, but a heavily mediated selection, shaped by what the Church allowed to endure. The Vatican vaults, libraries, and archives are not just repositories of preserved knowledge, they are archives of exclusion. For every document that rests on their shelves, there are others that were burned, banned, or buried. Any investigation into the evidentiary black holes of religious history must confront this legacy. The absences in the historical record are not silent. They are structured, cultivated, and maintained. They reflect decisions made in offices of power, justified by theology, and enacted through destruction. Until the full history of censorship is made visible through unrestricted access to Vatican records, honest accounting of suppressed traditions, and critical re-examination of doctrinal boundaries, the intellectual past will remain, in part, an artifact of fire. Relics have occupied a central role in the devotional, liturgical, and political life of the Roman Catholic Church. From fragments of the true cross to bones of saints, from vials of alleged sacred blood to the burial shrouds of Christ, relics are treated not only as sacred objects, but as physical evidence of divine history. Their presence in cathedrals, basilicas, and chapels across the Christian world signals a tangible link to the transcendent, a bridge between earthly existence and spiritual authority. Yet this veneration rests on a foundation marked by contradictions, unverifiable provenance, and strategic placement. Many relics with dubious or contested origins are displayed, preserved, or buried under Vatican custodianship, raising questions about whether these objects function more as political instruments than as authentic, historical witnesses. The medieval period saw a dramatic expansion in the acquisition and display of relics. Churches competed to obtain sacred objects, knowing that possession conferred not only spiritual prestige, but economic and geopolitical advantage. Relics attracted pilgrims, which brought wealth, influence, and institutional elevation. Entire regions became religious centers by virtue of the relics they claimed to possess. In this context, the authenticity of relics often became secondary to their utility. Multiple churches claimed the same relic, 3 or more holy lances, several heads of John the Baptist, and countless fragments of the true cross circulated simultaneously. The Church neither consistently verified nor disavowed these claims. Instead, it sanctioned them through liturgical inclusion and ecclesiastical endorsement. Within this system, the Vatican emerged as both the apex repository and the ultimate arbiter of relic authenticity. Possession by the Vatican itself often functioned as an implicit certification. Yet few of the relics in its custody have undergone independent verification, scientific testing, or transparent cataloging. Access to the most controversial or potentially disruptive artifacts is tightly controlled. Their origins are often shrouded in legend, oral transmission, or unverifiable donation chains. Requests by historians or scientists to analyze relics, especially those claimed to be of apostolic origin, are routinely denied or deferred indefinitely. This preservation of ambiguity protects the spiritual aura of the object while avoiding exposure to empirical scrutiny, The strategic use of relics becomes especially clear in moments of institutional crisis or geopolitical negotiation. During periods of doctrinal fragmentation, such as the Reformation, relics were used to reinforce Catholic orthodoxy and counter Protestant iconoclasm. The Church doubled down on the materiality of faith, emphasizing sacred objects as evidence of divine continuity. Relics were not only preserved, they were weaponized. Papal gifts of relics to monarchs, nobles, and newly converted nations functioned as instruments of diplomatic alignment. The gifting of a saint's bone or a Marian garment was a gesture of both spiritual favor and political integration. These objects moved across continents, not by accident, but by calculation. The Vatican's management of relics thus reflects an economy of sacred objects. Their value lies not in confirmed historicity, but in perceived legitimacy. That legitimacy is institutionally managed through secrecy, pageantry, and restricted access. The Church controls the narrative surrounding relics through hagiographies, ecclesiastical documentation, and ritual veneration. Relics that serve institutional narratives are promoted and displayed. Those that contradict or complicate doctrine are relegated to obscurity, stored in private vaults or sealed containers, often with minimal documentation. Perhaps the most emblematic case is the Shroud of Turin, believed by many to be the burial cloth of Jesus Christ. Although it resides in Turin, its control has historically involved the Vatican, which initially distanced itself from the relic and later accepted it as an object of veneration without declaring it authentic. Scientific testing in the late 20th century cast serious doubts on the shroud's dating, suggesting a medieval origin. The Church's response was cautious, acknowledging the results without disavowing the relic's significance. This ambivalence is a template for how controversial artifacts are managed, by permitting symbolic utility to coexist with empirical uncertainty. Beneath Vatican Hill and within its restricted archives are likely stored numerous relics that have never been publicly disclosed. These may include early Christian artifacts, Roman-era objects reinterpreted as sacred, or materials collected from suppressed sects. Their concealment is not necessarily driven by malicious intent, but by institutional logic. Revealing relics that challenge doctrinal history, such as alternative burial items, ritual objects from heretical groups, or relics contradicting apostolic geography, could destabilize the Church's narrative authority. In such cases, concealment functions as doctrinal protection. Even the known relics housed within the Vatican are often subject to controlled visibility. The Sancta Sanctorum, the private papal chapel once within the Lateran Palace, was known to hold some of the most venerated relics in the Church. Access to it was historically restricted to high-ranking clergy, and many of its contents were never catalogued for public knowledge. Similarly, the reliquaries of St. Peter's Basilica include objects whose origins are described vaguely or attributed through legend rather than documentation. These ambiguities are not corrected but maintained, enabling faith to fill the evidentiary void. The Vatican's refusal to subject relics to consistent forensic analysis underscores its reluctance to allow scientific discourse to challenge theological claims. While relics are sometimes tested, the results are often withheld, selectively interpreted, or dismissed. Radiocarbon dating, material composition analysis, and contextual archaeological study are tools available to the Church but only applied when the likely outcome aligns with institutional interests. When analysis threatens foundational stories, the relics remain locked away, their significance left intact through narrative control rather than evidentiary support. Relics are also instrumentalized in the creation of saints and the expansion of Church influence. Canonization processes often involve the discovery or authentication of bodily remains, personal belongings, or objects touched by the candidate. These relics are then distributed to churches and pilgrimage sites to extend the saints' cult and reinforce papal decisions. The selection and veneration of relics in this context are not historical acts, but institutional performances designed to validate papal authority and cultivate devotional networks. What emerges from this pattern is a theology of material control. The Church does not simply possess relics, it curates their meaning, manages their visibility, and determines their interpretive boundaries. These sacred objects do not speak for themselves. Their voices are mediated through institutional filters. Their presence used to affirm orthodoxy, and their absence used to erase contradiction. The Vatican's vast collection, much of it sealed, unexamined, or uncatalogued, is not a neutral archive, but a curated arsenal of symbolic legitimacy. Until full access is granted to these relics, both physically and historically, their status remains suspended between belief and verification. They serve not as proofs of divine history, but as instruments of ecclesiastical authority. In the hands of the Vatican, relics function as political tools, masquerading as sacred testimony. Their preservation ensures the endurance of tradition. Their concealment ensures the stability of narrative. The economy of relics is thus not one of faith alone. It is a calculated system of symbolic capital, leveraged to maintain control over the past and authority in the present. The Vatican's physical structures are more than architectural marvels or devotional spaces. They are deliberate constructions of control. Among the most enigmatic and contested of these are the sealed vaults and subterranean chambers beneath Vatican Hill. These are not passive storage facilities or relic repositories. They are active instruments in the Church's strategy to manage what is known, what is remembered, and what remains forgotten. The architecture of these vaults, their restricted accessibility, and their ambiguous contents point to a logic of concealment that extends beyond the material. These are not merely rooms beneath stone. They are mechanisms that define the limits of inquiry, designed to weaponize absence and transform silence into doctrine. Unlike conventional archives, which operate on principles of cataloging, preservation, and eventual disclosure, the Vatican's underground vaults resist classification. Their existence is acknowledged in vague terms, but no comprehensive map, inventory, or procedural manual has ever been released to external observers. Requests for access are routinely denied, and even Church scholars rarely speak with authority about their full scope. These voids are not merely spatial, they are epistemic. Their purpose is not only to store objects or documents, but to deny external validation, to create a condition in which only the institution can define what is or is not real, significant, or sacred. This architecture of opacity is by design. The placement of access points, the use of sealed stone, and the integration of undocumented corridors serve more than structural or defensive purposes. They enable a hierarchy of visibility in which certain areas are showcased to the faithful and to visitors, while others are deliberately obscured. The visual and spatial logic of the Vatican divides its knowledge into two domains: the curated surface and the restricted underlayer. Above, a narrative of transparency is performed. Beneath, a practice of concealment is enacted. The deeper one descends literally and institutionally. The further one moves from public accountability. Vaults beneath religious institutions are not unique to the Vatican. Temples, cathedrals, and monasteries have long included crypts, ossuaries, and chambers. But the Vatican's use of these spaces is singular in both scale and secrecy. Few comparable institutions possess an area so vast, so structurally integrated into their claim to divine authority, and so thoroughly shielded from public oversight. This shielding is justified through appeals to sanctity, tradition, and preservation. Yet preservation here functions as an alibi. The claim that materials are too sacred or too fragile to expose functions not as a conservation strategy, but as a means of denying historical accountability. What lies within these vaults remains speculative by necessity, but their role in the production of ignorance is demonstrable. Their very inaccessibility transforms them into epistemic weapons tools that do not merely prevent access to facts, but redefine the terms by which knowledge itself is constructed. The inability to verify claims, examine artifacts, or cross-reference historical documents ensures that the Church remains the sole interpreter of its own history. This closed-loop system renders dissent not only dangerous, but practically incoherent. Without access to counter-evidence, alternative narratives cannot be substantiated. Without material to analyze, scholarship becomes dependent on sanctioned releases, filtered through layers of institutional intention. The architecture thus becomes a form of theological expression. The vaults signify more than secrecy. They symbolize the belief that truth is custodial, not communal. The Church positions itself as the guardian of divine mysteries and, by extension, of historical reality. To challenge that position is to breach not only protocol but cosmology. The spaces beneath Vatican Hill are made physically inaccessible, but they also enforce a metaphysical inaccessibility. Their design mirrors the Church's epistemology. Truth is hidden, guarded, and only revealed through authorized channels. Logic becomes most apparent in periods of institutional stress. When controversies arise, be they related to doctrinal crises, abuse scandals, or theological dissent, the Vatican retreats into its spatial core. Requests for documents are delayed. Internal inquiries are held behind closed doors, and vaults become shields against transparency. The very existence of these spaces enables non-response. Inquiries can be redirected to procedural limitations, archival restrictions, or the presumed sanctity of the material involved. In this way, the architecture serves as both a defense mechanism and a narrative device, preserving the image of the Church as infallible by withholding the means to challenge it. The weaponization of space is not metaphorical. Throughout history, vaults and sealed chambers have been used not only to store artifacts, but to incarcerate individuals, conceal sensitive correspondence, and protect politically dangerous documents. During the Counter-Reformation, the Inquisition used subterranean spaces to interrogate and contain dissidents. During the 20th century, reports emerged of classified materials related to wartime diplomacy, clerical abuse, and doctrinal conflict being stored in deep vaults, inaccessible even to many within the Church. These spaces become zones of legal and historical exception, places where ordinary rules of disclosure, review, and ethical responsibility do not apply. Even within the Church, access to these spaces is stratified. Only select officials vetted over decades are permitted to enter. This stratification mirrors the institution's hierarchical structure, reinforcing the belief that truth is a privilege, not a right. Lower clergy, theologians, and lay scholars are expected to accept doctrinal narratives on trust, while the materials that could confirm or contest those narratives remain locked away. The architecture supports a pedagogy of obedience, one in which questioning is disincentivized by structural and procedural inaccessibility. This condition has created a culture in which knowledge is not pursued but received, not discovered but administered. The vaults beneath Vatican Hill do not merely contain history, they control its interpretation by regulating who may touch it. The Church's ability to refer to hidden materials without having to produce them gives it rhetorical dominance in any historical or theological debate. Assertions can be made without fear of contradiction because the evidence lies beyond reach. Claims to apostolic succession, relic authenticity, or doctrinal purity can invoke buried records that no one is permitted to examine. The question of what lies in these vaults is secondary to the effect their inaccessibility has on historical discourse. The very fact that they exist and remain closed creates a deficit of knowledge that shapes the boundaries of debate. The Church has not only stored materials within them, it has stored silence, ambiguity, and strategic absence. These voids are not passive gaps in the record. They are engineered absences, constructed through architecture and policy to achieve a specific result, the maintenance of unchallengeable authority. Until these vaults are subjected to independent oversight, the Church's version of history will remain a self-referential system, insulated from contradiction and critique. The architecture of concealment is not incidental, it is central to the institution's survival. These spaces do not merely hold the past. They define the limits of what the present can know about it. In this way, the Vatican vaults are not relics of secrecy. They are active participants in the suppression of historical truth. Despite the Vatican's claims of commitment to truth, scholarly integrity, and historical preservation, its interaction with independent researchers is marked by a pattern of restriction, obstruction, and silence. The institution presents itself as a repository of divine wisdom and historical continuity, but when approached by investigators seeking to verify, revise, or interrogate aspects of that history, it deploys a rigid system of denial. The case. Histories of modern scholars, historians, archaeologists, theologians, and archivists reveal the consistent use of bureaucratic filters, discretionary rejection, and selective disclosure to prevent critical inquiry. These cases are not anecdotal aberrations. They form a systemic pattern that points to an institutional culture hostile to unsanctioned discovery. Access to the Vatican Apostolic Archive, often mischaracterized in popular discourse as fully open to researchers, remains tightly controlled. Only a narrow segment of historical material is accessible, primarily related to church administration and correspondence from papal reigns long past. Researchers must submit extensive documentation, including references, publication histories, and detailed project descriptions. Even with such credentials, many are rejected without explanation. Others are granted partial access, often to documents that are already published or of little significance to controversial subjects. The criteria for acceptance or refusal are opaque and non-negotiable. Appeals are neither heard nor formally processed. This lack of accountability turns the archive into an instrument of exclusion. One well-documented example is the experience of historian Michael Heisman, who attempted to investigate the early Christian burial traditions beneath Vatican Hill, particularly the claims surrounding the tomb of St. Peter. Despite credentials, published works, and church affiliation, Heisman was denied access to the full archaeological reports from the mid-20th century excavations. Requests to study specific findings or to consult restricted sections of the scavi were refused. The justification, preservation concerns, and institutional discretion did not align with the access already granted to other Vatican-approved scholars. The message was clear. Investigation is tolerated only when it supports the preferred narrative. Similar barriers faced theologian Jutta Ranke-Heinemann, one of the first women to hold a chair in Catholic theology in Germany. Her critical work on church doctrine and the role of women in early Christianity brought her into conflict with ecclesiastical authorities. Attempts to access specific historical records were blocked, and she was eventually stripped of her authority to teach Catholic theology. The suppression of her research was not due to methodological flaws, but because her conclusions challenged institutional dogma. Her case underscores how academic dissent, even when grounded in theological tradition, is punished when it threatens structural authority. More broadly, the Church's treatment of scholars researching the role of the Vatican during World War II illustrates the selective transparency of the institution. While parts of Pope Pius XII's papacy have been open to researchers, key documents remain classified. Several historians, including John Cornwell and Susan Zuccotti, reported that crucial materials relating to the Vatican's knowledge of the Holocaust, its financial dealings, and its post-war refugee networks were unavailable or had been removed from the archival listings. Cornwell's controversial book, Hitler's Pope, was based on partial evidence and raised questions precisely because fuller access was denied. The Vatican responded with rebuttals, but without providing the documents that could settle the dispute. Instead of transparency, it offered institutional defensiveness that in 2020, following repeated international pressure, the Vatican announced it would open the archives related to Pius XII. However, scholars quickly noted that while access was nominally granted, procedural delays, limited cataloging, and redacted documents made comprehensive research difficult. Several reported encountering blank files, misfiled documents, and restrictions on photographing or copying sensitive materials. These tactics frustrate meaningful investigation while preserving the appearance of openness. The Church maintains control not only over what is accessible, but how it may be studied, reproduced, and discussed. Another barrier is the limited access to the Archivum Romanum Societatis Iesu, the central archive of the Jesuit order. Though technically separate from the Vatican, it operates under a similar regime of exclusion. Researchers seeking to examine Jesuit interactions with indigenous cultures, suppression of non-Christian beliefs, or early missionary writings frequently encounter rejections or are funneled toward heavily curated secondary materials. The reasoning typically centers on concerns over misinterpretation, confidentiality, or the supposed irrelevance of the requested materials. In practice, this restricts access to documents that may reveal cultural erasure, ethnographic manipulation, or the political use of evangelization. Cases of blocked archaeological work also reinforce the pattern. Excavations beneath church-controlled sites are often halted, redirected, or forbidden when discoveries challenge established narratives. In 2005, independent researchers hoping to resume exploration of the Domitilla catacombs, an important early Christian site in Rome, were denied further access after preliminary findings suggested syncretic burial practices and non-canonical inscriptions. Requests for renewed permits were stalled, and no clear explanation was given. Similarly, efforts to study pre-Christian religious layers beneath St. Peter's Basilica have been consistently obstructed. The concern is not the integrity of the site, but the preservation of a singular historical narrative. The Church also exerts influence over funding and publication channels. Scholars who challenge the Vatican's version of history often find themselves marginalized within academic networks that rely on ecclesiastical approval or access. Independent publishers may hesitate to promote works that are likely to provoke Vatican opposition. Invitations to conferences or symposia hosted by church institutions are withdrawn. Peer review processes are weaponized to discredit scholarship that deviates from institutional expectations. This informal censorship enforces conformity through structural dependency rather than overt prohibition. These examples accumulate into a model of epistemic governance. The Vatican permits investigation only within pre-validated frameworks. Dissent is not openly combated with counter-evidence. It is prevented through inaccessibility, delay, and reputational control. Historical scholarship is acceptable only when it reinforces, or at least does not contradict, official narratives. The vaults, archives, and excavation sites are not just sites of physical restriction. They are nodes in a wider system of knowledge management. The result is that truth, when it contradicts institutional interests, remains permanently provisional. Independent investigators cannot confirm, deny, or revise key aspects of religious history because the evidence remains concealed. This creates a paradox. The Church insists on the historical veracity of its teachings while denying the means to test them. In doing so, it transforms faith into a shield against verification and authority into a substitute for evidence. Until access is granted unconditionally and without ideological filtering, the history preserved in the Vatican's custody cannot be regarded as complete. The denial of access to modern investigators is not a technical issue, it is a strategic policy. It reflects a deeper conviction that historical control is integral to theological authority. For the Church, the past is not a field of inquiry. It is a territory to be defended. Modern historical chronology is treated as a stable framework, linear, cumulative, and empirically reconstructed through cross-referenced records, dated artifacts, and synchronized calendars. Within this framework, the Church situates its narrative as the custodian of civilization's moral and intellectual inheritance. Yet when examined critically, this temporal scaffolding reveals structural weaknesses. Certain periods appear disproportionately silent, others suspiciously dense. Entire centuries, especially in the early Middle Ages, exhibit anomalous characteristics: uniformity of record, lack of archaeological strata, replication of artifacts, and documentary repetition. These dead zones of history, chronological vacuums where empirical evidence thins, suggest not mere gaps, but possible fabrication. The Vatican's central role in developing and preserving the Western chronological model positions it not only as a contributor, but as a possible architect of deliberate historical construction. The most provocative hypothesis in this regard is the phantom time theory, first proposed in the 1990s by German historian Herbert Illig. According to Illig, approximately 300 years specifically, from 614 to 911 C, were artificially inserted into the historical timeline. He argued that the scarcity of reliable documents, architectural development, and material culture from this period could not support its conventional duration. The implication was staggering: a centuries-long chronological inflation, orchestrated by authorities to serve institutional needs. While this theory remains on the margins of mainstream historiography, it forces a re-evaluation of the Church's role in timekeeping, document preservation, and the manufacture of historical continuity. The Church has long been the steward of Western temporal authority. The Anno Domini dating system, devised by Dionysius Exiguus in the 6th century, became the liturgical standard and was later imposed as a civil framework across Europe. This system was not based on contemporary astronomical calculations, but on theological considerations. Its retroactive placement of Christ's birth year has since been shown to contain errors, yet it remains foundational to the Church's historical self-definition. More critically, the dating system was administered, adapted, and propagated through monastic scriptoria many under direct or indirect Vatican oversight. The responsibility for calibrating time was entangled with ecclesiastical aims, particularly the alignment of Easter saints' feast days and the synchronization of sacred and secular calendars. During the so-called Dark Ages, ecclesiastical institutions became the sole producers, transmitters, and conservators of written history in Western Europe. Secular documentation was minimal. Royal annals, economic records, and even military campaigns were often filtered through monastic interpretation. This concentration of narrative power meant that the Church was uniquely positioned to both create and preserve history, with little external oversight. Chronological records, such as the Anno Regni, Francorum, or the Chronicle of Fredegar, were produced in isolated contexts and later interpolated by unknown hands. The Vatican's role in validating these records, incorporating them into Church-sanctioned chronicles, and aligning them with its theological calendar raises questions about the authenticity and motivations behind their composition. Archaeological evidence from the early medieval period compounds the problem. Major urban centers such as Rome, Constantinople, and Aachen show minimal architectural development during the supposed phantom centuries. In many cases, structures dated to this period lack stratigraphic support, show reuse of earlier materials, or display stylistic features identical to pre-existing models. Coinage, ceramics, and inscriptions exhibit limited variation across long time frames. Entire regions of Europe appear to have entered a cultural and technological stasis, an implausible scenario given known patterns of human development. While wars, plagues, or economic collapse can explain stagnation in specific areas, The uniformity of this phenomenon across disparate geographies suggests an alternative explanation: chronological compression or invention. Documentary anomalies further support the suspicion. Key documents from the early Middle Ages survive in few copies, often preserved in Vatican-controlled archives. Many of these texts were first catalogued or referenced centuries after their supposed composition. The Vatican's authority as the certifier of historical authenticity means that these documents, once entered into church annals, became unquestionable. Subsequent historical writing depended on these foundations, and deviations were either suppressed or marginalized. The cumulative effect is a historiography built on unverified assumptions, where doubt is institutionally discouraged and empirical scrutiny is constrained. The Gregorian reform of the 11th century represents another moment of chronological reordering. Pope Gregory VII's standardization of church practices extended to the calendar and timekeeping. During this period, older documents were recopied, corrected, and harmonized with revised liturgical norms. The potential for insertion, deletion, or reinterpretation of dates and events was considerable. Combined with the lack of original manuscripts from the early medieval period, these editorial interventions blur the line between preservation and revision. The Vatican's control over these processes and its refusal to release all manuscript versions for comparative study preserves the ambiguity, one of the few external mechanisms capable of challenging church chronology. Astronomical data has revealed inconsistencies. Eclipses, comets, and planetary alignments recorded in medieval chronicles often fail to match actual celestial events when retrocalculated using modern models. These mismatches, though often dismissed as copyist errors, occur with a frequency and pattern that warrants further investigation. If historical events were backdated or fabricated to fit theological frameworks, celestial data would expose the incongruity. That such data is rarely referenced in Vatican historical validation suggests either avoidance or inability to reconcile discrepancies. The conceptual danger of phantom time is not confined to theoretical chronology. It implicates the Church in the deliberate construction of historical continuity, a necessary condition for its claim of uninterrupted apostolic succession, moral guardianship, and cultural inheritance. By extending its lineage across empty centuries, the Church fortified its legitimacy. Gaps in historical record were not acknowledged but filled, often with hagiographic accounts, miracle stories, and sanitized royal biographies. These insertions reinforced the Church's centrality, concealed transitions of power, and masked ruptures that might otherwise invite theological or political reconsideration. Critics of these claims argue that the absence of evidence does not constitute evidence of absence. Yet in historical inquiry, patterns of silence, repetition, and uniformity are themselves data. The disappearance of entire cultural layers, the recurrence of identical document forms across decades, and the absence of technological development over suspiciously long periods challenge the default assumption of linear historical development. When combined with an institution that controls both the archives and the interpretive apparatus, these anomalies warrant rigorous skepticism. The Vatican's refusal to subject its archival holdings to broad, independent chronological audit perpetuates the uncertainty. The tools of modern historiography, carbon dating, paleographic analysis, astronomical correlation, are inconsistently applied or withheld altogether. Requests for multi-institutional collaboration are often met with deflection. The materials that could either validate or disprove the existence of phantom time remain locked in secure facilities, inaccessible to the very scholars best equipped to assess them. The dead zones of history are not simply moments of silence. They are epistemic frontiers where the boundaries between fact and fabrication, between continuity and construction, remain unresolved. Whether or not specific centuries were invented in totality, The mechanisms for doing so were unquestionably present: concentrated control of documentation, absence of external oversight, and theological incentives to fill temporal voids with convenient continuity. Until the Vatican opens its archives fully and submits to external methodologies of historical verification, the question of phantom centuries remains suspended, not because the evidence has been evaluated, but because it remains by design. Beyond reach, archaeology, at its core, is a discipline of recovery, of piecing together fragments, sites, and strata to reconstruct the human past. When applied to religious history, particularly that of early Christianity, archaeology becomes more than an empirical pursuit. It becomes a battleground of interpretation, access, and control. Nowhere is this dynamic more pronounced than in the context of the Vatican. Underneath its sprawling cathedrals and across its administered territories, the material remnants of pre-Christian, early Christian, and heterodox traditions lie entombed in layers of stone and sediment. Yet these remains are not excavated freely. The Church's management of archaeological inquiry is defined by selectivity, supervision, and the quiet redaction of findings that do not serve its doctrinal narrative. The result is a landscape where the past is not merely hidden, it is curated, and inconvenient truths are physically buried beneath dogmatic construction. The Vatican's relationship with archaeological investigation has always been guarded. While it has financed and endorsed certain digs, especially those likely to affirm its theological claims, it has simultaneously restricted or redirected inquiries that pose interpretive challenges. This approach was made evident during the mid-20th century excavations beneath St. Peter's Basilica, initiated under Pope Pius XII. Publicly, the dig was promoted as a pious endeavor to locate the tomb of St. Peter. Privately, it was conducted under intense secrecy, with findings filtered through ecclesiastical review before any form of public disclosure. When remains were found near a monument marked with ambiguous inscriptions, Church authorities swiftly interpreted them as Peter's. Despite inconclusive anatomical, stratigraphic, and textual evidence, the scientific community was largely excluded from the process. Reports were not subjected to peer review. Physical access was limited to a small circle of clergy and Vatican-approved archaeologists. Requests for independent analysis were delayed or denied. This pattern, repeated in subsequent projects, underscores a key institutional principle: archaeological findings beneath sacred sites must support, or at least not undermine, existing doctrine. Where ambiguity exists, the Church reserves interpretive authority. Where contradiction emerges, findings are downplayed, omitted, or recontextualized. The archaeological sites beneath Rome reveal this pattern. Beneath the Lateran complex, early Christian and Roman structures intersect. Despite the potential for groundbreaking revelations regarding early Christian worship practices and interactions with surrounding religious cultures, excavations have been sporadic and closely supervised. Reports from the 1930s and 1950s note discoveries of cultic artifacts, inscriptions with ambiguous theological references, and non-canonical Christian symbols, some of which were quietly removed from site documentation. Photographs disappeared. From archives, field notes remain unpublished. Scholars who participated in these digs later reported that Vatican representatives intervened at crucial moments to redirect excavation strategy or sequester artifacts, even outside the Vatican walls. Ecclesiastical influence often determines whether and how excavations proceed. In southern Italy, parts of Spain, and sections of the Holy Land, Church-affiliated institutions control access to historically significant religious sites. Archaeologists working in these areas report encountering pressure to interpret findings in ways that affirm ecclesiastical narratives. In some cases, permits are revoked when preliminary data suggests divergence from accepted timelines or doctrinally approved sequences of development. Funding tied to Catholic institutions is contingent on cooperative publication and public messaging. The boundaries of scholarly freedom are constrained not by evidence, but by institutional preference. One particularly illustrative case occurred at Nazareth in the early 2000s, where an excavation revealed domestic structures predating traditional timelines of early Christian habitation. While initial reports indicated that these findings might challenge assumptions about the historical Jesus' birthplace or the development of the region's Christian character, subsequent church-sponsored studies reframed the interpretation to align with biblical accounts. The discrepancy between raw data and published narrative reveals a familiar pattern. The data exists, but its meaning is governed by a theological lens. The issue is not limited to suppression of results. It includes the proactive avoidance of excavation. Many potentially significant sites beneath churches, catacombs, and monasteries remain unexcavated by design. The Vatican's policy of non-disturbance ostensibly in respect of sacred ground functions as a tool of epistemic control. By choosing not to dig, the institution avoids the risk of encountering data that could destabilize foundational stories. Beneath the Vatican itself, layered beneath basilicas and crypts, lie Roman-era burial chambers, Mithraic temples, and pre-Christian artifacts. While some have been studied under tightly controlled circumstances, large portions remain untouched. No public documentation exists detailing what lies beneath several centuries of architectural construction. The official justification is reverence. The practical effect is a strategic preservation of ignorance. Redaction is another common practice. Field reports undergo ecclesiastical review before being published. Details deemed theologically sensitive are removed or reworded. In several instances, entire excavation campaigns have been summarized in bland communiques devoid of substantive findings. Scholars attempting to trace the original data stratigraphic maps, carbon dating results, object inventories, find them either missing or classified. The material past, when it conflicts with the narrative past, is subjected to deletion or reinterpretation. This posture has implications beyond theology. The suppression or misrepresentation of archaeological data hampers broader historical and anthropological understanding. It prevents insight into early Christian diversity, interaction with other religious traditions, and the social dynamics of the ancient Mediterranean. It shields the institution from the messy complexity of its origins. Most critically, it obstructs the principle that empirical evidence must inform historical interpretation, not the reverse. Institutional responses to criticism focus on preservation ethics, theological sensitivity, or the need to avoid sensationalism, yet these rationales collapse under scrutiny. Sites managed by secular archaeologists also face preservation challenges, but they operate under peer-reviewed standards, transparent documentation, and public accountability. The Vatican's closed system lacks these checks. The difference is not technical, it is ideological. The Church does not fear decay of stone. It fears erosion of control. The integrity of religious history depends not on affirming inherited narratives but on engaging openly with the material record. As long as excavation remains contingent on institutional consent and findings are filtered through doctrinal review, the discipline of archaeology will remain compromised. The earth beneath Vatican Hill and beneath many church-administered sites contains answers to questions the Church has refused to ask. Until those layers are systematically and transparently investigated, history remains curated not by evidence, but by silence. Long before Vatican Hill became the symbolic and administrative center of the Catholic Church, it was a site layered with cultural, spiritual, and religious significance. The idea that it functioned only as a neutral landscape until Christianity sacralized it is a convenient fiction. In reality, Vatican Hill and its surrounding regions were home to a diverse array of religious practices, temples, and funerary complexes. Many of these belong to traditions that either preceded Christianity or coexisted with its early development. These pre-Christian layers are not speculative. They are archaeologically attested. What remains obscured deliberately and institutionally is the extent to which these foundations were absorbed, overwritten, or suppressed. The Vatican's refusal to fully engage with or publicly document the pre-Christian strata beneath its seat of power reflects a deeper anxiety that the site's spiritual authority may rest on appropriated ground and that its sacred geography is less a divine revelation than a palimpsest of concealed gods. Roman sources and modern archaeology confirm that the area now occupied by Vatican City was, in antiquity, outside the sacred boundary, pomerium, of the city of Rome. It was used for burial grounds, gardens, and rural temples. Notably, the Vaticanus Ager contained several necropolis and was associated with oracular and prophetic traditions. The name Vatican itself is believed by some etymologists to derive from vaticinare, to prophesy, implying a long-standing association with spiritual utterance and liminal practices. This area was not devoid of spiritual meaning before Christianity arrived. Rather, it was already symbolically charged. One of the most significant cultic presences in this region was that of Mithras. The Mithraic mysteries, a syncretic, initiatory religion centered on the god Mithras, flourished throughout the Roman Empire from the 1st to 4th centuries CE, particularly among the military. Mithraea, or underground temples dedicated to Mithras, have been discovered in close proximity to the Vatican necropolis. At least one Mithraeum was uncovered near the site of St. Peter's Basilica during excavations in the 20th century, yet its documentation remains partial and its significance downplayed. The similarities between Mithraic iconography and Christian symbolism, such as the dying and resurrected Savior motif, the communal meal, and the use of subterranean ritual spaces, have long prompted scholarly inquiry. The Church's silence on these parallels is strategic, avoiding questions about cultural borrowing and theological adaptation. In addition to Mithraism, archaeological evidence points to the presence of other cultic structures, including temples to Cybele, Isis, and possibly Etruscan deities. These religions occupied the same symbolic terrain later claimed by the Church. Their rituals, sacred topography, and visual vocabularies would have been familiar to early Roman Christians. The Church's appropriation of spatial and symbolic elements from these traditions, while insisting on their eradication, reflects not a clean theological break, but a process of religious supersessionism. The gods were not defeated. They were repurposed, renamed, or buried beneath new liturgies. The construction of the original Constantinian Basilica in the 4th century CE involved deliberate modification of pre-existing structures. The terrain was flattened, graves were displaced, and temples were dismantled. In many cases, the Christian edifice was built directly atop earlier sacred sites. This was not mere convenience. It was ideological architecture. By physically occupying the spaces of rival cults, the Church performed a symbolic conquest of competing cosmologies. But in occupying those spaces, it also inherited them. The ritual weight of the land, its histories and associations, remained embedded in the stones and soil, even as the Church tried to erase their origins. The Vatican necropolis itself, located directly beneath the current basilica, contains tombs with iconography that does not always conform to Christian expectations. Pagan motifs, syncretic symbols, and ambiguous inscriptions complicate the narrative of an early and uncontested Christian presence. Yet these findings are either sequestered or reinterpreted to fit institutional expectations. For example, inscriptions invoking Sol Invictus or funerary art depicting Orphic themes are explained away as transitional or misunderstood. The possibility that these reflect coexistent or hybrid religious identities is downplayed. Despite broader evidence that late antique Rome was characterized by fluid spiritual affiliations, the reluctance to engage with this complexity is institutional, not academic. Independent archaeologists and historians have repeatedly pointed to the need for a more comprehensive study of the pre-Christian substrata beneath the Vatican. However, the Church's control over access, documentation, and publication has stymied such efforts. Excavation permits are limited, findings are routed through ecclesiastical review, and raw data is often withheld. Even when relics of other religions are discovered, they are typically removed from context, stored out of view, or reinterpreted through a Christian lens. This strategic obfuscation serves a doctrinal purpose. The Church's claim to unique and unbroken spiritual authority is weakened if the sacredness of its geography is shown to be inherited rather than revealed. The acknowledgement that Vatican Hill was once a polytheistic cultic zone undermines the claim of exclusive divine election. Moreover, public awareness of this history risks inviting comparisons between Christian rituals and earlier religious practices, further diluting the aura of originality and divine mandate. The Church's theological framework requires that the space it occupies be portrayed as spiritually empty before its arrival, an unclaimed zone made sacred by Christian presence. The archaeological reality contradicts this. The hill was not a void, but a site of spiritual saturation. To recognize this is to admit that Christianity emerged not in a vacuum but in dialogue, and sometimes in conflict with its religious environment. The Church has opted for erasure over acknowledgement. The implications are significant. If the Vatican's geography is inherited, then its authority becomes a question of historical convenience rather than divine designation. If its foundations rest on absorbed temples and redirected ritual energy, then the sanctity of the site is not pure, but palimpsestic. These are not abstract philosophical concerns. They are central to the Church's self-conception. As long as the material evidence of these pre-Christian layers remains suppressed, inaccessible, or misrepresented, the Vatican's narrative remains intact, but only through omission. The silent gods beneath Vatican Hill are not entirely lost. Their altars, inscriptions, and iconographies persist in fragments, in reburied floors, in modified masonry. They exist as archaeological ghosts, not fully excavated, not fully erased, until their presence is acknowledged without theological filtering. The Church's claim to historical transparency remains compromised. The divine monopoly it asserts is in truth a layered inheritance, one that it has systematically concealed beneath centuries of doctrinal architecture. The Vatican is not merely a religious institution. It is a sovereign entity, a geopolitical actor with the legal, diplomatic, and territorial status of a state. This distinction is critical in understanding its ability to maintain secrecy, enforce doctrinal control, and resist external accountability. Unlike other religious bodies, the Vatican possesses all the instruments of nationhood: borders, embassies, legal codes, treaties, and security forces. This sovereignty enables it to operate with a degree of impunity unmatched by other institutions. In practice, it allows the Vatican to shield its archives, regulate scholarly access, refuse external oversight, and negotiate historical narratives on its own terms. The result is a geopolitical structure specifically configured to enforce epistemic sovereignty, control over what may be known, studied, or remembered. The Lateran Treaty of 1929, signed between the Holy See and the Kingdom of Italy, formalized the Vatican's independence. It recognized the Vatican city-state as a distinct political and territorial entity under papal authority. In doing so, it extricated the Church from subjection to Italian law and, by extension, from many international norms concerning transparency, historical preservation, and cultural heritage. This autonomy is not merely symbolic. It means that Vatican institutions, including its libraries, archives, and museums, are not subject to UNESCO protocols, European Union data access regulations, or Italian archaeological conservation laws. The Vatican is the final authority over its own material past. This legal insulation allows the Vatican to control the terms of historical inquiry. Documents stored within the Apostolic Archive, formerly known as the Vatican Secret Archive, are subject to internal classification systems. Access may be restricted indefinitely, not based on external ethical standards or scientific relevance, but on criteria defined within the Curia. Scholars who request access must agree to institutional conditions, including prohibitions on full reproduction, requirements for theological alignment, and the obligation to submit research intentions for prior review. The state structure of the Vatican makes these terms enforceable in ways no other religious body could manage. Sovereignty also empowers the Vatican to resist demands for disclosure in matters of historical controversy. Investigations into the Church's role in the Holocaust, its financial ties to authoritarian regimes, and its management of internal scandals have all encountered roadblocks grounded in jurisdictional immunity. Requests for full archival transparency during Pope Pius XII's tenure were delayed for decades. Even after selective releases in 2020, crucial documents remained classified, and researchers encountered bureaucratic obstructions ranging from limited catalog access to delayed appointment confirmations. Because the Vatican is not accountable to any secular court, these practices cannot be legally challenged from outside. Diplomatic sovereignty further enhances this control. The Holy See maintains formal relations with over 180 countries and participates in international organizations such as the United Nations and the World Health Organization. These relations are not with Vatican City as a geographic entity, but with the Holy See as a sovereign diplomatic body. This dual status, spiritual authority and political subject, permits the Vatican to leverage religious legitimacy in the conduct of statecraft. In practice, this translates to influence over national educational curricula, historical framing and treaty negotiations, and the management of religious heritage sites worldwide. It also enables the Vatican to lobby governments against funding, research, or supporting publication efforts deemed hostile to its narrative interests. This geopolitical autonomy is reinforced by the Vatican's intelligence and security apparatus. The Gendarmerie Corps and the Swiss Guard serve both ceremonial and protective functions, but they also play roles in internal security. Their responsibilities include monitoring access to sensitive areas, escorting unauthorized researchers, and guarding sealed locations, physical and archival. The Vatican's internal intelligence channels monitor the activities of theologians, journalists, and academics whose work intersects with contested church narratives. This information is used not only to regulate access, but to manage reputational risk. Those seen as adversarial may find access denied without explanation, see their publications quietly discredited through Vatican-linked institutions, or be excluded from scholarly forums sponsored by Catholic universities. The Vatican also engages in international legal negotiations to protect its holdings. When faced with claims concerning looted artifacts, disputed relics, or contested manuscripts, it has invoked sovereign immunity. These claims have included demands from Jewish communities for wartime documentation, indigenous groups seeking return of cultural objects, and secular governments requesting historical records for truth and reconciliation efforts. In nearly every case, the Vatican has resisted external adjudication. Its legal position is that these materials are part of a sacred patrimony, outside the purview of national or international legal claims. Beyond defense, the Vatican uses its sovereign status to actively shape global historical discourse. It sponsors research initiatives, academic chairs, and publishing houses that promote a curated vision of church history. These resources are deployed strategically. Scholars who operate within the approved interpretive range receive access to archives, funding for fieldwork, and platforms for dissemination. Those who deviate face institutional marginalization. This creates an ecosystem of scholarship that self-regulates around the limits of Vatican tolerance. An epistemic environment in which certain questions are never asked because they are structurally impossible to pursue. The Vatican's geopolitical sovereignty thus becomes a mechanism of historical control. It enables the Church not merely to protect its version of the past, but to enforce it across borders. Through diplomatic leverage, legal immunity, and extraterritorial governance, it ensures that challenges to its narrative remain peripheral. The vaults beneath Vatican Hill are not simply inaccessible due to theological sanctity. They are protected by international law, guarded by sovereign immunity, and insulated from the normative checks that constrain other actors. In this context, the Vatican is not a passive custodian of historical materials, but an active shaper of historical possibility. It has weaponized sovereignty to define the perimeter of inquiry. It determines not only what is preserved, but what is allowed to be discovered. Its borders are not just physical, they are epistemic and ideological. Its silence is not absence, but assertion. The geopolitical structure of the Vatican ensures that its silences carry the force of law. Its archives are not open to challenge. Its claims are insulated from correction. Its authority is reinforced not by public scrutiny, but by diplomatic recognition. Until this sovereignty is interrogated as part of any historical investigation, the full scope of what lies hidden beneath its ground, within its vaults, and behind its claims cannot be known. The transition from paper to digital mediums has been heralded as a revolution in transparency and accessibility. Archives once locked behind stone walls or nestled in remote repositories can now, in theory, be accessed instantly by researchers around the world. For many institutions, digitization has meant the democratization of information. But in the case of the Vatican, digital transformation has introduced a new layer of opacity, one more refined, less visible, and far more efficient. While the Vatican has publicly embraced digitization initiatives, particularly through its apostolic library, the selective nature of what is scanned, redacted, indexed, and made available online reveals a sophisticated system of digital censorship. The result is a carefully curated simulacrum of openness that preserves the Church's control over historical memory while shielding its most sensitive materials from scrutiny. The Vatican Apostolic Library's digitization project, launched with fanfare in the 21st century, involves partnerships with international institutions and private technology firms. The stated goals include preservation, modernization, and academic collaboration. In practical terms, however, the vast majority of digitized materials are already non-controversial and well-known: medieval manuscripts, theological treatises, liturgical books, and ecclesiastical correspondence, with little bearing on disputed narratives. The process is framed as exhaustive, but it is in fact highly selective. No public catalog exists detailing what has not been digitized. The absence of entire document series is obscured by the visibility of those chosen for display. Researchers have noted that the digitized collection is disproportionately weighted toward visually ornate, but textually conventional materials. Illuminated manuscripts and decorative codices are prioritized, reinforcing the aesthetic value of the Church's heritage without engaging with its most politically or theologically volatile records. Meanwhile, documentation from sensitive eras, the Inquisition, the Crusades, the Reformation, colonial missions, and modern geopolitical alignments remain largely inaccessible in digital format. When queried, Vatican representatives cite resource limitations, preservation needs, or technical challenges. Yet the consistency with which controversial materials are omitted suggests deliberate curation rather than incidental delay. The issue is not merely absence, but alteration. In digital environments, redaction becomes more difficult to detect. Textual deletions, image cropping, and metadata manipulation can occur without leaving visible marks. scholars who have compared original microfilm copies of Vatican materials with their digitized counterparts have observed inconsistencies, missing pages, blurred annotations, removed marginalia. The Vatican provides no comprehensive policy on digital redaction, no mechanism for verifying the integrity of scanned materials, and no recourse for contesting omissions. The digital archive, unlike the physical one, is structured to prevent detection of what has been excised. Digital indexing further compounds the problem. Search functions are built around controlled vocabularies, predefined metadata tags, and internal cataloging systems. If a document is not indexed with certain keywords, it effectively becomes invisible to researchers. Documents related to suppressed sex, banned texts, or ecclesiastical trials may exist in the digital repository, but remain unsearchable unless their internal references match pre-approved tags. This indexing architecture creates a dual archive, one visible and searchable, the other buried beneath algorithmic exclusion. Access becomes a function not of content, but of classification. The Vatican has also adopted proprietary formats and restrictive licensing terms for its digital materials. Documents are often presented in non-downloadable formats, limiting their usability for scholarly analysis. Optical character recognition, OCR, capabilities are inconsistently applied, making text extraction unreliable. In some cases, watermarking or image resolution limits prevent detailed examination of handwriting, seals, or marginal notes. These restrictions are justified as protective measures, but they function as deterrents against in-depth research. They preserve institutional control while simulating public access. A parallel development involves the Church's increasing use of artificial intelligence and machine learning to manage its archives. While few public details are available, statements by Vatican officials have alluded to AI-assisted cataloging, redaction, and language translation. These technologies, if applied without external oversight, introduce the risk of algorithmic bias, misclassification, and silent deletion. An AI trained to flag sensitive content could exclude entire categories of documents from researcher access, reinforcing existing patterns of censorship through automated processes. Without transparency in how these systems are designed and implemented, the Vatican's digital infrastructure becomes a black box, one that processes historical records according to internal priorities, not scholarly or ethical standards. Digital diplomacy also plays a role. The Vatican's partnerships with global technology firms, some of which involve data storage on private servers, place portions of its archive under corporate jurisdiction. This outsourcing raises concerns about data sovereignty, access continuity, and the potential for extraterritorial suppression of content. In scenarios where religious history intersects with state or corporate interests, digital materials could be quietly modified or removed without public notice. The Church's insistence on confidentiality clauses and non-disclosure agreements in these partnerships further obscures accountability. These dynamics are not unique to the Vatican, but the consequences are amplified by its unique dual role as a religious and political authority. The use of digital infrastructure to reinforce epistemic control reflects a broader institutional strategy: maintain the appearance of progress while consolidating control over historical narratives. The digital vault is not a neutral innovation. It is a continuation of centuries-long practices of selective memory, adapted to new technologies. What emerges is a digitally enhanced architecture of concealment. Researchers are permitted to view curated fragments of the past, framed by institutional interface and regulatory metadata. They navigate a surface of openness while being denied the means to interrogate the archive's absences. This system reshapes the epistemology of historical research. What cannot be searched cannot be cited. What is not scanned cannot be questioned. What is redacted cannot be known to have ever existed. until the Vatican publishes a full and independently verified inventory of its holdings, including documents not yet digitized, materials classified as sensitive, and records excluded from indexing. The integrity of its digital archive cannot be taken at face value. Artificial history is not built through false documents, but through structured omission, digital silence, and managed visibility. The most effective concealment in the digital age is not physical sealing, but algorithmic exclusion. As digitization continues to be promoted as a solution to institutional opacity, it must be critically examined in the Vatican context as both a tool and a veil. The future of religious historical inquiry depends not on what is now visible online, but on what remains obscured behind code, policy, and unaccountable discretion. The cumulative investigation into the Vatican's sealed vaults, restricted archives, and controlled historical narratives reveals more than isolated cases of institutional secrecy. It reveals a systemic architecture designed not only to curate knowledge, but to define the very conditions under which knowledge can exist. Across geography, chronology, documentation, and access, the Catholic Church, through the Vatican as its sovereign center, has established an ecosystem in which truth is a function of control. The implications for religious history, epistemology, and scholarly practice are profound. What remains necessary, then, is a framework capable of confronting this architecture directly, an archaeology not of stone or inscription, but of forbidden knowledge itself. Such an archaeology begins not with a trowel, but with a methodology, a systematic examination of the silences, redactions, and exclusions that shape the historical record. This method does not assume absence to be accidental. Instead, it treats absence as data, a signal of where institutional pressure has operated, where records have been destroyed or sealed, and where narratives have been constructed to replace those no longer permitted. It analyzes patterns of erasure, which centuries yield the fewest manuscripts, which theological ideas appear only through condemnation, and which archaeological layers remain unexcavated without explanation. An archaeology of forbiddance knowledge also interrogates institutional structures. It does not accept gatekeeping as a neutral practice of stewardship, but examines the legal, theological, and political mechanisms that determine what is protected, what is visible, and what is withheld. It identifies where control is concentrated within specific Vatican congregations, archival departments, or theological commissions, and maps the flow of information from origin to public dissemination. It recognizes that modern digitization, far from neutralizing past suppression, introduces new technologies of concealment through algorithmic control, selective scanning, and metadata management. This approach must also account for the role of sanctioned narratives in framing perception. Official church history is not merely a set of claims. It is a program of interpretation designed to neutralize contradiction. Apparent continuity is imposed retrospectively. Apostolic succession is smoothed over centuries of schism, debate, and power struggle. Relics are authenticated by decree, not verification. Dogmas emerge as final statements without revealing the contested discourses that preceded them. The archaeology of forbidden knowledge begins precisely at these points of false finality. It seeks the preconditions, the suppressed alternatives, and the decisions that led to closure. Moreover, this investigative framework requires critical analysis of ecclesiastical language. Terminology such as sacred, heresy, or tradition operates as boundary markers, drawing lines between permissible and impermissible thought. These terms are not fixed but function within power structures to police theological and historical legitimacy. An effective archaeology parses how such terms have evolved, how they have been used to exclude, and how they continue to shape the boundaries of inquiry. A key principle of this method is refusal to privilege institutional access over independent analysis. The Vatican's archive is not the only source of evidence. Suppressed manuscripts, parallel traditions, apocryphal texts, and material culture from non-Christian sources offer triangulating data points. Comparisons between canonical and non-canonical sources, between public and private theological writings, and between institutional archaeology and secular excavations can yield critical insights into what the Church has preserved versus what it has obscured. The methodology also includes forensic scrutiny of publication history. Many Vatican-sanctioned discoveries or translations are introduced through tightly controlled channels, often edited, excerpted, or reframed. An archaeology of forbidden knowledge tracks the life cycle of such releases, when they were announced, under what circumstances, and what was omitted. It considers what internal debates preceded their publication and whether contradictory material was simultaneously suppressed. Institutionally, this approach demands accountability. A full inventory of sealed or restricted materials, including dates of acquisition and reasons for classification, should be the minimum expectation for any institution claiming to steward global spiritual and historical heritage. Where materials are not accessible, the Vatican should be required to explain the conditions under which they would be released and what standards determine their classification. Without such transparency, the archive remains a closed system of epistemic authority immune to external critique. Practically, scholars must cultivate alternative spaces for inquiry. Open access repositories, interdisciplinary research consortia, and decentralized peer review structures can serve as counterweights to Vatican monopolization. These platforms should prioritize the publication and contextualization of non-canonical, fragmented, and marginalized sources. They should track denied access cases and create public records of research obstruction. The silence imposed by sealed vaults must be answered by the noise of collective intellectual resistance. This does not mean abandoning theological or historical rigor. On the contrary, the goal is to apply those standards more universally beyond the limits set by a single institution. A theology that cannot endure scrutiny, a history that depends on secrecy, and a doctrine that survives only through narrative exclusion are not sustainable under critical inquiry. The Church, if it claims universality, must subject its own claims to universal standards of evidence, coherence, and transparency. Ultimately, an archaeology of forbidden knowledge demands a shift in posture. It does not begin by asking what is permitted to be known, but rather, what has been prevented from being known and why. It regards archives not as neutral spaces, but as sites of struggle-contested zones where memory, authority, and truth are negotiated. It recognizes that the most consequential discoveries may not be found in newly opened vaults, but in patterns of silence that run through the record like architectural fault lines. The Vatican's sealed vaults, locked codices, and inaccessible strata beneath its basilicas are more than physical barriers. They are manifestations of an epistemological system designed to manage not just access to knowledge, but the scope of what knowledge is allowed to mean. Until those vaults are opened, not only with keys, but with accountability and intellectual courage, the pursuit of truth will remain partial. The cost of that partiality is borne not only by historians, theologians, and archaeologists, but by every effort to understand the past as it was, rather than as it has been allowed to appear.